Good evening. Call to order the first meeting of the new year 2020 for the Parks and Rec Commission. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Cribbs?
Here.
Vice Chair Greenfield?
Here.
Commissioner Lemaire?
Here.
Commissioner McCauley?
Present.
Commissioner Moss?
Here.
Commissioner Olson? Here. Commissioner Rectal?
Here.
Councilmember Koo?
Here.
Thank you. I want to welcome a couple new faces to the dais. First, Commissioner Olson is joining us now. We've had 3 consecutive years with the same commission members, so we welcome some new blood on the commission. And I've met with you personally and really am impressed and look forward to you contributing to our commission and our community. So thank you. And also our new staff liaison this year will be Councilmember Koo. I've known you for many years and look forward to the guidance and passion that you can offer our commission, and welcome you to join us as often you're able to.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
I also would be remiss not to say one more word of thanks for former Chairman Don McDougall. Thank you, sir. Who has moved on, and we'll miss his guidance and his passion for parks and recreation and everything therein contained, and hope that we can do him justice this year and continuing his work and keeping it going. So thank you. Are there any comments, changes, or requests, deletions regarding the agenda? If not, then next up is oral communications. Do we have any speaker cards from the public to comment on items not on the agenda? Thank you. Great. First speaker will be Shani Kleinhaus, followed by Mark Weiss.
Good evening. I'm Shani Kleinhaus with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society and a resident of Palo Alto. I'm going to be a bit of a broken record this evening. I want to talk about native plants and pollinator gardens and pollinator pathways in the city. And every one of your items has something to do with that. I've been working through Audubon to look at how to enhance habitat for birds in the urban areas. We've worked with Google a lot. We worked with Facebook on the roof. If anybody wants to visit, let me know. We can take you there. And what we learn is that it's really, really important to start moving away from planting, even if it's a species that is easy to maintain and doesn't require a lot of water. If it's not native, it doesn't provide the services, the ecological services that the wildlife and starting with the bugs and ending with the birds need. And so I would like to speak to you, but I know you have a presentation about some of the wonderful gardens that we already have. I think every park should have them, and every place where you have some kind of a corridor, whether it's a street or a creek, shouldn't be enhanced with native plants, because that's how you can create that. And it's actually in the park's master plan, because I know I worked on that when I was part of that task force. So I'll come back and talk about some of those in more detail. But one other thing I wanted to let you know, on the 12th of March, there will be a symposium in Mountain View about green streets, and their view of green streets is inclusive of ecological infrastructure. So it's not only looking at how do we get people to move through, cars to move through, bicycle pedestrians, but it's also looking at how do the birds and the bugs move through, and how does water infrastructure fit in, and how the underground system fits in. So they're trying to have a very, very comprehensive view. I will send something to Darren and he can distribute it to you. And I hope you actually take part in that symposium. The city of Palo Alto is supporting it, so that, just so you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Weiss.
Good evening, board members, commissioners. My name is Mark Weiss. I actually have two things to talk about in the 3 minutes, so if I don't get to it, both of them or all the points, I'll send it to a letter to council or a letter to y'all. I seem to have two threads going with various commissioners or groups of commissioners. One is about basketball and one is about music. And I was going to talk about music in my 3 minutes, but there were some emergent things this week with basketball. So while the Palo Alto Historical Association had a presentation this weekend with Dave Newhouse, a former sports writer who grew up in Menlo Park, and it wasn't on topic of his event, but a famous Palo Alto basketball player named Jim Loskatoff, who was a world champion for the Boston Celtics and Pali class of 48. He would be turning 90 years old next week, February 4th, and I thought we should remember him. I actually had proposed years ago when Yahweh Yeh was the mayor in 2011, and he actually discussed this with Ron Wyden, another famous Palo Alto basketball player from Pali High, who is a U.S. senator. The idea is something to do with naming the basketball courts of our parks in honor of famous Palo Alto basketball players. And at the time, in 2011, had to do with the renovations of Seal Park, the former Stockton Park, the former De Anza schoolyard. And there's an article you can find I wrote in 2011 on my blog called Plastic Alto is the blog, which is a jazz reference, but it was called The Lockhart Lou Proposed. And it's a little bit off topic, but it did sort of generate some of the same ideas. Kent Lockhart was a famous basketball player from Palo Alto. They used to say that there were 3 L's who were the top players: Kent Lockhart, Jeremy Lin, and Jim Loskatoff. Jeremy Lin has risen above them, but anyhow, so I'd like to maybe talk about that sometime, but I'm really here to talk about music in that I've been running a concert series at Mitchell Park Community Center in the relatively new building, celebrating its 5th anniversary. The people of Palo Alto authorized a $41 million bond initiative a few years back, if you recall, and as a private company called Earthwise Productions, I've produced 10 events at Mitchell Park, and I have about another 10 on sale right now. And it's my idea of it's not quite a public-private partnership, but as a private citizen, I just like to leverage our public support for the arts. And I had been a consultant years ago to some of the Music in the Parks events, and I think, for example, Mitchell Park Bowl is a good idea for doing events. And we still do a little bit. I think it's less than we did a few years ago with the Twilight series and the Cogswell Plaza Brown Bag series. And it's not the exact purview of this department. It's almost more of a Arts Commission topic, but I think at least one commissioner said it was of interest to him, and the general topic of how can we use our parks to sort of cross-pollinate, if it were, with the arts community. By the way, I'm going to stay for here about Juanita Salisbury. I think she's doing a great job. Anyhow, so good luck this year, commissioners. Thank you for your service, and council member, and look forward to talking with you all about either basketball or music. Thanks.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to the next item, which is the department report.
Good evening, Darren Anderson with Community Services Department. I just would like to reiterate that warm welcome to our new council liaison, Councilmember Lydia Koo. Thanks so much for being here. And to our new Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Jackie Olson. We're very glad to have you. If there's anything I could do to support either of you and your roles here, please let me know. Staff strives to support and provide good service to this commission. I wanted to let you know about a community meeting coming up at Ramos Park. It's scheduled for tomorrow evening from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. at the Cubberley Community Center, room A6. I wanted to let you know about a structure at the Baylands called the Tide Gate. This structure was built in 1956, and its function was to separate the bay water from this flood basin area because water was backing up. When high tides meant heavy rainfalls, it would flood certain portions. It did in 1955, and they built this structure. Well, the structure is near its end of its life now, and Santa Clara Valley Water District is responsible for replacing it. So they've been thinking about the design and working on a capital project to replace it. It's coming soon. They're working on I think the 30% design now. And I explained to them in the recent meeting that this would have to come to the Parks and Recreation Commission. It would need a park improvement ordinance, which is required when you make a substantive change in a park or preserve. So they understand that. They'll be coming soon and explain more details about it. So the next step I think they're planning is a community meeting in March 2020. I'll share that with the commission and, of course, our other Bayland stakeholders. As soon as I get it, it'll be noticed by the water district. And then I imagine shortly thereafter, they'd be coming to the commission to discuss it, explain it in more detail, and collect your feedback. And then shortly after that, I assume it would be a request for your recommendation on a park improvement ordinance. That would go to council for their approval.
So, can I ask for a clarification?
Sure.
So what was flooding? Parts of the Baylands?
So this
or-
is 1955 that the flooding happened, and it flooded, the high tides came in with the rain, and it flooded areas of the residents, not the Baylands itself, but, so this is the confluence of 3 creeks go into this flood basin, the 622-acre flood basin. You have Matadero, Barron, and Adobe that all come into the same basin. And at the time, there was nothing to stop the bay water from coming in as well. So as you had that high tide and it made heavy rainfall, there was no place for the rain to go.
This is just past Bixby?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. Yeah, and when we come back, I'll have a full map and I can walk
Okay.
you through all of it, and the water district will as well. Just wanted to apprise you it's coming. The pedestrian bicycle bridge across 101 project started on January 14th. That was the notice to proceed. I don't believe you'll see any construction activity just yet, but it'll be coming soon. Right now, they're working on sort of the behind-the-scenes preparation, and that'll go through July 2021 for that project. The council retreat is scheduled for Saturday, February 1st, 9 a.m. in the Palo Alto room at Mitchell Park Community Center. Each year, the city council reviews its priorities for the year at its annual council retreat. And a council priority is defined as a topic that's going to receive significant attention during that year. And typically, priorities have a 3-year time limit, although certain continue beyond that time period. That is Saturday, February 1st at 9 a.m. at Mitchell Park Community Center in the Palo Alto room. I wanted to apprise everyone that the 24th annual Palo Alto Mayor's Tree Planting and Canopy Award Ceremony is coming up. This is Thursday, January 30th at 5:15 p.m. to 8 p.m. And this is also at the Mitchell Park Community Center. Each year, Canopy and friends host a party in honor of the Palo Alto new mayor to kick off the new year, and they plant a tree as well. And that everyone's invited. You can RSVP or go online at info@canopy.org to learn more about that. And there was an email that came out a little earlier from my colleague, Catherine Borquin, notifying the commission that the city clerk's office and the city attorney's office are working on setting up a Brown Act training that'll be coming soon. Catherine's email also had information on the Brown Act, good reminders that we're all obliged to follow. Also, your PRC handbook has more information on that as well. And that concludes the department report.
Thank you. So the first order of business is to elect a new chair and vice chair. Normally, the previous chair would be reviewing the chairperson's role, and staff would be commenting on the procedures for electing the chair. As the vice chair, I will just give a quick overview of the chair's role. A primary role is presiding at meetings and being in charge of applying the rules of conduct of the meeting. The chair shall call or cancel meetings, coordinate the setting of the agenda with the staff liaison, ensure timely start and end of meetings, work to keep agenda items moving, ensure that public testimony is received but not allowed to disrupt the meeting, and setting an acceptable time limit for public input if necessary. The chair should clarify ideas as they are discussed and repeat motions made in order that all members understand the motion they'll be voting on. Responsible for ensuring actions that are properly moved, the actions are properly moved, seconded, and voted upon, and work to see that the commission maintains focus on the issues before them and doesn't discuss or act upon items not listed on the agenda as prohibited by the Brown Act. The chair serves as a spokesman for the commission, representing the views and opinions of the commission as a whole when speaking on its behalf. And the time commitment is, in general, can be similar to other commission roles, depending on how active commissioners may be with the ad hoc committees. Certainly, some of the ad hoc committees get very deep in the time commitment and are extensive roles similar in commitment to the commissioner, or to the chair and/or vice chair. Darren, would you like to give us an overview on the procedure?
Yes, thank you. The protocol for the election of the new chair and vice chair, these are both one-year terms, and the process is that the chair would open the floor to nominations for the chair position. Commissioners would nominate one commissioner at a time, and the person nominated must be present. A commissioner may enter their own name in nomination, and the person offering the nomination can explain why they've nominated that person, why they feel they'd be appropriate for the position. The chair will ask the nominated person if they're willing to accept the nomination. We'll continue to nominate additional candidates with each nomination. The chair again asking the person if they're willing to accept the nomination. When there are no further nominations from the floor, the chair will ask for a motion to close nominations. The staff secretary will distribute a single paper ballot to each commissioner, and the names of the nominees are repeated by the staff secretary in the order in which they were nominated. Each commissioner writes in one name of the person they wish to vote for and returns that completed ballot to the staff secretary. Staff secretary will count the votes and read them out loud, and the elected chair assumes responsibility for chairing the remaining portion of the meeting. And then we'll repeat that same process for the vice chair.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? If not, then I'll open the floor for nominations of commissioner or chairman. Keith?
I'd like to nominate Jeff Greenfield for chair.
Thank you. Would you like to speak to the nomination?
You've been vice chair for 2 years. I think you've done well. You've been trained under Don, and I think it's time for you to move up.
Thank you. I accept the nomination. Are there any other nominations?
Could I just speak to support the nomination
Yes.
at this point? I agree with Commissioner Rectal. I believe that you've served well as the vice chair, and I know you're certainly committed to Palo Alto and to the community, and you spend a ton of time on a lot of issues, so I've been very impressed with that. I believe that you will serve the whole commission and present the views of the commission to other people as you serve as sort of the face of the Park and Recreation Commission, so I would certainly support the motion.
Thank you for your kind words. A last call for additional nominations, and I would ask for a motion to close nominations. So we need,
I so move.
second?
Second.
Thank you. So now, I guess the staff secretary should, do you have any further instructions? Do you need to read the names of the people nominated? Thank you.
One for Greenfield from Commissioner Olson. One for Greenfield from Lemaire. One from McCauley for Greenfield. One from Commissioner Greenfield for Greenfield. One from Commissioner Rectal for Greenfield. One from Commissioner Cribbs for Greenfield. And one from Commissioner Moss for Greenfield. 7 for Commissioner Greenfield.
Thank you. And I know this is what we were instructed to do, but it seems like there must be a more efficient approach. I appreciate your confidence and look forward to serving the community and the commission and really being a conduit for all of the issues that we'd like to discuss. I'm passionate about this work and look forward to working with you, but it's really a team effort, and I think we've always prided ourselves as being a very flat commission and really spreading out the work and the credit to all the members, and I look forward to continuing working with all of you in a similar vein. We'll now open the nominations for the vice chair after I review the roles of the vice chair. The general role of the vice chair is to assist the chairperson in responsibilities serving the commission. This includes serving as the acting chair when the chair is not available, whether that be at regular Parks and Recreation Commission meetings or other community events. Also assisting with other tasks as requested by the chair. In the past, this has included working with staff and the chair on planning meeting agendas and other matters, and this is a practice that I would certainly like to continue as the chair, and also providing guidance to the chair and the commission as needed, which may also include sitting next to the chair during meetings and discreetly bumping elbows and offering guidance or helping keep me on track as needed. Are there any questions regarding the role of vice chair? With that, I'll open the floor to nominations for vice chair. Keith.
I hope she's interested. I'd like to nominate Ann Cribbs. You've been on the commission for quite a while. You're well thought of on the commission and the community. I think you'd be a real asset, and I hope that we can do some arm twisting here.
Well, thank you very much. However, now I'm not sure about the protocol because I would like to put into nomination another person on the commission. So what do we do?
So the first order is, do you accept the nomination?
I did do that.
So you have accepted the nomination?
Yes, I will.
Okay. Now we're still open for additional nominations.
So I would like to nominate Commissioner McCauley. I have worked with him on several committees, and he has been always just very thoughtful, very inclusive. I think he has a great future in Palo Alto, and he always appreciates all the sides of the issues and makes people feel like they're being listened to. So I think he would be a great vice chair.
And Commissioner McCauley, do you accept the nomination?
That's very kind of you to say, Ann. Thank you. There are not enough good things to say about Ann Cribbs. Will I accept the nomination? I'm inclined, frankly, not to, because I would love to see Ann serve as the vice chair. I'd also love to see Jeff Lemire serve as the vice chair. So, Ann, I don't know if you'd like to flip a coin or what. I guess I will reluctantly accept, but I wonder if we might be able to take just a 30-second break.
So you're asking to recess for
Yes.
for 30 seconds for a brief recess. I think we need to vote to agree to recess. And so if there isn't any further discussion at this moment, all in favor of a recess, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, we are now in recess.
joke about the ham and eggs breakfast, the chickens involved, but the pig is king. That's your other plug.
I will now call the meeting back into order. Do we have any further comments from commissioners regarding the nominations for vice chair?
Please. I would like to decline the nomination.
Very well. So as it stands, we have one nomination for vice chair for Ann Cribbs. Do we have any other nominations for vice chair? If not, then I'll ask for a motion to close the nomination process.
I so move.
And a second?
I second.
He beat you. Okay, we now have closed the nomination process for vice chair, and we go to our ballots. Excuse me, Darren, with only one nomination, is it necessary to read all of the ballots, or is it?
I think we should, and we'll just go through it quickly.
Okay.
In the interest of full disclosure.
One for Cribbs from Olson, one for Cribbs for Lemaire, one for Cribbs from McCauley, one for Cribbs for Greenfield, one for Cribbs from Rectal, one for Cribbs from Cribbs, and one from Moss for Cribbs. 7 unanimous.
Thank you, and congratulations, Vice Chair Cribbs.
Thank you, and I look forward to working with you and with all the commissioners. I think we'll have a very good year.
Great, so let's move on. The next item is the approval of draft minutes from the December 10th, 2019 Special Parks and Recreation Commission meeting. Does anyone have any comment on the minutes?
I move to approve the minutes from the December meeting.
Thank you, and a second, please.
I'll second.
And for those commissioners who were participating in the meeting, all in favor of approving the minutes? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. And we'll now move on to the next item, which is the presentation on pollinator gardens in Palo Alto.
Just 1 second, Chair, while we load up the presentation, please. Chair, would you like to introduce our guest, or shall I?
Please go ahead.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Juanita Salisbury. As background, Juanita has a PhD in biopsychology from the University of Florida, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture from West Virginia University. In 2009, she established the Juanita Salisbury Landscape Architecture firm after working for commercial and residential design firms. And recently, she's turned her focus to California native pollinator habits. And in 2016, established the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden, the first of 5 pollinator gardens here in Palo Alto. Her focus is to research and educate about these habitats, as well as exploring opportunities to install more of them. And I personally would like to acknowledge Dr. Salisbury. She donates a tremendous amount of time to designing and building and maintaining these pollinator gardens. She's incredibly generous with her time and expertise, and a true asset to our community and our department. Really grateful for you being here.
Thank you, Darren, for inviting me to come and speak to the commission tonight. It's a pleasure, really, to do these gardens, and it's a real privilege to be able to do them. and to talk about them, which I do quite a bit. So without further ado, let's go right into the presentation. Here we have on the first slide is basically just says what our name is, and a little bit about me. I wanted to also mention that in my area of psychology, I started to study ingestive behavior, the biology and the physiology of eating and drinking. And then I moved on to landscape architecture, and for many years I wondered what did one have to do with the other. And now that I design and install pollination habitats, pollination is really at the basis of the food chain. So I'm still studying ingestive behavior just for insects, basically, at this point.
I don't know if you want to put it into the slide presentation.
Slide mode?
Yeah.
I can't see it. Let's see, where is it?
To the right.
To the right?
One more.
One more, that one, right?
Oh, is it that one?
Yeah, click on it.
No.
Yeah.
And then I think you want to go all the way to the left.
There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
And we also have a social media presence, so we like to keep everybody informed on Facebook and Instagram. And most of those posts are of my macro photography. I go out several times a week to categorize and look at the various insects that are in the garden. So I have years of research of these weekly observations. Slide.
If not, we can do it with this one with the arrow keys.
There we go. Okay. So as Darren mentioned, we have 5 gardens right now. Our first garden was the first garden, Primrose Way Pollinator Garden, which is located very close to my house. And this is how I became interested in this space. It was just there waiting for a garden. And the second garden is the Arcadia Place Pollinator Garden, which is located off of Newell Road and Arcadia. The third garden is the Island Drive Pollinator Garden, and that's between Hamilton and Edgewood on Island Drive. The fourth garden is the Gwynda Street Pollinator Garden, which is on Embarcadero, right across the street from Rinconada Park. And the one that we just finished installing is the Hopkins Avenue Pollinator Garden, which is adjacent to the tennis courts behind the new fire station. And it turns out if you Google Pollinator Garden Palo Alto, the gardens pop up on Google Maps and you can do virtual tours. So that's been very helpful to get people to go and visit the gardens. So this is what it looked like back in 2016. This is the Primrose Way site beforehand. As you can see, grass, there's some cherry trees on the left there and camphor trees on the right with the sidewalk, Embarcadero Road, there off to the right, a very busy, noisy street. So that space wasn't really doing much of anything. It was just sitting there, and I saw this as an opportunity to really get into planting more native plants and to research some of the effects that native plants have on biological resiliency and habitat function. And so I approached the Parks and Open Space people and said, you know, can I do this? I'm a licensed landscape architect. I will do everything. I will do the fundraising, the maintenance, the site prep, the volunteer coordination, the design. And the response was so great and so supportive. They were like, show us your design. And I did, and they were good. And so without further ado, we got started. I set up a GoFundMe site because I'm not a nonprofit, I'm just an individual, so raising money can be difficult in these days. So GoFundMe is a great way to raise money for an individual. And a Palo Alto Know Your Neighbor grant, which also provided some funding, along with some donated mulch and logs from the city, as well as in-kind donation from a local building supply company of boulders. And the entire neighborhood where I live came out to plant over a course of several weekends. And now I know all of my neighbors. I know every last one. Before I was kind of baseless and sort of anonymous in the neighborhood. I would see people, but there was no reason for me to talk to them. And now people run when they see me coming with plants. The city also added some signage to each of the gardens. This was the first sign, wonderfully designed by a good volunteer that we have. Each of these signs includes more information for people so they can do some research on their own, as well as featuring some photographs of the various insects that we see in the gardens. This is what the Primrose Way Garden looked like in the spring. And this garden has over 50 native plant species. It has more annual species than the other 4 gardens, so it has a different flavor. And it's really magical in April, May, and June when these flowers are just blooming like crazy. So I would encourage the commission, if you all want a tour of the gardens, I'd be happy to arrange that. They're always open, but it would be nice to take you all around and show you the gardens during the height of bloom. I think you'd really like that. So that was pretty spectacular, and it was noticed by a lot of people. There's another view looking west. Again, spring 2019. That was what I called our super bloom last year. Again, another picture, and this garden was also featured on the Going Native Garden Tour that the California Native Plant Society organizes every year, and we had 150 people show up to that. It was just wonderful and just really busy the entire day, and everybody loved it. And they're always looking for more Palo Alto gardens, so we have some now for them. So the city liked the Primrose Way Gardens so much that Mark Ribeiro came to me and said, well, you know, we just finished doing some maintenance on Arcadia Place, which is a cul-de-sac. Will you design something for us? And I'm like, sure, okay. And so the city provided planting, and the same year, December, we went out and planted it up during a gigantic rainstorm. And beforehand, though, we did community outreach. So I put together a flyer that tells the surrounding houses what we're doing, what the design looks like, and how they can get in touch with me if they have any comments or questions. And we didn't really get any feedback, so we took that for approval and went ahead and planted the garden up. And this actually, the picture down on the lower right, is what it looked like during the spring. There's a mix of annuals and perennials in there, and about a dozen different species. Even in that small area, you can really fit in a lot of natives. The third garden, Island Drive. This is a spot I had my eye on. After doing the first garden, I started scouting locations, and this one looked particularly juicy. So as you can see, the before shot there in 2017, about 4,000 square feet of ivy and a non-native cedar tree. So I asked for permission to design something for that, and Mark Ribeiro actually said, well, you can apply for a grant from the Happy Hollow Foundation's Progress for Pollinators grant program, and we got the first grant that they had that year. That it was the first one ever that they awarded. And the city was very kind in removing the ivy for us and providing mulch, which I'm forever grateful for the ivy removal, and to enhance the irrigation there as well. So again, we did the community outreach. We distributed flyers to the surrounding houses, and again, you know, not really very much response, but when we were out planting with our volunteers, the neighborhood came out and people were walking by, and the great comment was, I've always wanted this to be a garden. And so we transformed it for them. Again, all by volunteers, and we also maintain that garden. And these are some pictures of how the garden has developed over time. The upper right was last spring, so just really coming into its own, and then a little later in the year down on the lower left there. This garden has more native plant species than all the other gardens. So we have over 70 plant species there. And again, another picture of this garden last spring and summer. I like to go there in the late afternoon, what I call the golden hour, and just see what's going on. It's a wonderful, quiet, nice spot. And you can also see there's a Happy Hollow sign there. They like to promote their pollinator program. The fourth garden, the Gwynda Street Garden. So this is further down. Actually, Darren asked me about this, and if I was interested, of course, I said yes. And this is a little pie wedge of ivy, or was, across from Rinconada on Embarcadero Road. And this spot, according to one of the neighbors, was ivy for over 60 years. We transformed it in a couple of weeks with over 20 native plant species. Again, we did our community outreach and then got a Happy Hollow Foundation grant again. And we went out and planted it up. And you can see there are some of the happy volunteers there. And this is what it looked like this last spring. Again, the wonderful signage provided by the city of Palo Alto. And we started to line the pathways with these branches to keep people from stepping on plants. This garden's wonderful. The neighborhood actually has come out to me and told me how much they liked it. And people are very supportive of this particular garden. They just love it. So our last garden, the one that we just installed, is the Hopkins Avenue Pollinator Garden. And this garden came about because the woman who lives next to the tennis courts was very interested in transforming this space. And so I was brought in to see what I could do. And of course, I was very happy to do something. And so I designed up another planting scheme for this. We did our outreach again to the neighborhood. Still, no negative kickback, which was really nice. The city again supplied mulch and was very kind to enhance the irrigation. Here, I like to irrigate maybe the first year or so. All of the other gardens right now, because it is the rainy season, we've turned off the irrigation. And this one will get a little bit more water while it's establishing. Again, we had a bunch of really great volunteers come out and plant this garden up. This is what it looks like after right now. You can't really see very much, but there's about 175 plants in here with over 20 different species. Again, a nice quiet spot. And so those are our 5 gardens, and I do a lot of public speaking about these gardens now. I speak for the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency, and I'm happy to always bring photos of the plants and the insect species that I see in our gardens and talk about those. And this is a slide that I actually use. Why California native plants? California, as most of you probably know, is a biodiversity hotspot. We have in California 1/4 of all of the plant species in the United States. That's a lot, almost 8,000 species. And many of them found nowhere else on the planet. They only occur in California. We have a lot of native pollinators here, about 1,600 species of native bees, again, more than any other state in the United States, which has about 4,000 all total. And we have such a huge number of both native plant species and our native pollinators because of the diverse ecosystems that we have here in California, as well as our number of native bee species. And these gardens are super important because pollinator species are declining worldwide, and other insect species are as well. So native plants are one way to combat some of those issues. again, this is a slide I use in some of my presentations. I like to call this one my photons to protein slide. And plants, as I always say, are the beginning of everything. They are the primary producers of food and the base of the food chain. So energy from the sun is converted by plants into food that is then eaten by insects and other animals. And in that middle picture, you can see there's a big, fat, juicy caterpillar there. That is on a Grindelia camporum at our Arcadia garden. I was very happy to find that caterpillar. And those caterpillars are preferred food for baby birds. They're super easy for the baby birds to swallow because they're soft and juicy. I like to refer to them as bird sausages. So anyhow, insects provide then food for baby birds and other animals. And what research is showing us is that gardens with at least 70% native plants are required to sustain populations of birds such as chickadees. The reason for that is because native plants are largely eaten by native insects. Non-native plants are not eaten by our native insects. So any non-native plant is not going to really efficiently and optimally provide food for insects. So it becomes sort of an ecological dead end. And this is how everything else in the food chain can access the sun's energy through plants. So native plants really solve a number of different issues. Aside from ecological issues, what I've noticed is that these native plant gardens really enhance and create community around them. Because these gardens change the way that these spaces look, it communicates something about these spaces, that there are engaged, caring people in this environment, which is something that's critically important these days. We care that we live here. We care to see beautiful things. Besides strengthening ecosystem resilience, there's health benefits. There are many opportunities that these gardens provide. They enhance neighborhoods. They become neighborhood amenities. One of the neighbors who lives in the Island Drive neighborhood said he felt like he was in Tahoe by walking through our garden. That was a wonderful compliment. Lots of engagement, lots of educational opportunities. Doing these gardens has increased the proportion of my time that I speak and educate now. So I'm moving away from designing for residential things and doing more educational opportunities. I've spoken to a lot of different groups. We do outreach here in the city through the open house that we do here every year. I've spoken to high schools, and I also like to provide each neighborhood that has a garden a newsletter, which you all have a copy of that, the first issue of the Pollinator Post, which kind of tells people, what are we doing? And we're not these things that occur magically. There are people that are doing this, and you can ask us questions, come out and talk to us, explore the other gardens, that kind of thing. So many opportunities. I have had so many positive comments from people who live around these gardens. One woman who lives by the Primrose Garden takes her grandson there almost every single day because he wants to see the bugs. And it's kind of a wild place for him, and he loves it. He has to go. Again, so pictures up there, we have the volunteers speaking, or me speaking actually down there in the lower right corner. I've distributed many seeds that we've collected in these gardens, so many opportunities, and there's just this large ripple effect that these gardens have in terms of what they provide, what they say, and what they do. And I never stop thinking about where is the next garden going to be. Across the street from the Primrose Garden, the people at the First Congregational Church liked that garden so much that they installed their own pollinator garden. And that strip of land between the road, Embarcadero Road there, and the sidewalk, it's about 10 feet wide, filled with ivy, and they're very interested in transforming it. And so after many talks and organizing a couple of different groups, we're working with grassroots ecology to get some funding to get rid of the ivy and maybe even some of the concrete to increase the size of that space, that's almost 1,000 square feet. It's a lot of land. And it would be a simple thing to plant with native plants once the ivy is gone. So there is always another space. And the gardens also help fulfill the pollinator pathways, part of the master plan that we have for our city. I'm happy to provide these nodes as well. They enhance so many things, and I see so many different species in these gardens. I know they're working. And so the things that are communicated through our gardens is that not only do we have a lot of species richness here, but we have a lot of abundance. And that's something that we can really leverage to really showcase all of the talent that we have here in Palo Alto. And we have so much talent. And it's an easy task, really, to plant these gardens. They eventually start taking care of themselves. We go out a few times a week to take a look at them. I like to go out and take a lot of photographs. They're fun places to be. But they really just, they just transform these areas, these neighborhoods in ways that I didn't anticipate. But they've all been really great. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to take these public pieces of land and make them into something that's beautiful and abundant and full of life. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your success story with us. And as you say, it is very much in line with our master plan objective of pollinator pathways. And it's really an inspiring story of how someone can take the initiative and really work with the community, both with staff and neighbors, and build up neighborhood support. So thank you. Before, we have a couple of comments from the public. Before that, do any commissioners have any clarifying questions? You'll get a chance to comment afterwards.
Chair, no, I just would like to say thank you. This is incredible, and when I read through the packet today, it just made me smile, made me happy. So it's beautiful, and thank you.
It's really a pleasure.
The commissioners will all have an opportunity to comment after the public speakers. Mark Weiss, followed by Shani Kleinhaus. 3 minutes.
I just wanted to say I thank Ms. Salisbury for what she did, and it's a good example of individuals taking the initiative and trying to either work with local leadership or set a high standard for involvement. So we've talked by phone, we've never met, so thanks for all you do.
Thank you. Shani?
Thank you. Shani Kleinhaus with Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society and resident of Palo Alto. Congratulations, Chair Greenfield and Vice Chair Krebs. So this is a beautiful, beautiful work. It's amazing, and the most amazing thing is that it serves both the community, bringing people together, and the ecological system that we're losing. And we're losing they're talking about the insect apocalypse. The birds have crashed by 50% in 30 years. We know what the result is of interfering so heavily. And people prefer often to plant something that doesn't have bug bites. The leaves do look pretty, there's no bites in them. But when there's no bites in the leaves, that means there's no caterpillars. If there's no caterpillars, there's no food for the birds, and there's no butterflies. So we really need to think about the entire food chain, and not only the pollinators that actually are attracted to the mature forms, that are actually looking at harvesting the pollen and the nectar from the flowers, but we really need to look at the entire system, including the little caterpillars that were called here sausages. Anyway, so I was on the Citizen Advisory Committee for the general plan update. Was that a couple of years ago, and the Sierra Club in Audubon together suggested the idea of pollinator corridors, which is implemented beautifully. And so I'm really glad to see that there is a start. I was disappointed to see that when in Ross Road, when they did all these updates, they put almost entirely non-native plants and almost no native plants, and if there's any way to change that and make those little islands, they have all sorts of plants there that are just like, why? Was that the cheapest they could get? And they seem to get cheaper the further south you get on the road. So I don't know if there's a way that could still be corrected. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that tomorrow, as the staff mentioned, there is a discussion of what to do at Ramos Park, and that is a place that's close to my house, and for a long, long time I was hoping to see a native plant garden there. There's a lot of ivy, there's areas with some other non-natives that could be replaced, and that would be really wonderful if that could be a component. I'd be happy to help in the neighborhood. I think our neighborhood really needs something to bring it together. It's a very kind of diffuse neighborhood, and this would really be something that people could aggregate around and feel some kind of identity that is to some extent missing. Right now, the thing that puts people together is running the dogs off leash in the evening, which is okay, but this would be an added value. So maybe you can consider that, and thank you. Thank you for what you do. It's just absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. Would commissioners like to comment? I'll start on this end with Commissioner Moss.
The last slide that you have, which shows the map, we did that for the master plan, but can you show us, when you talk about a pollinator pathway, can you show us on the map some like a grand plan for a pathway? And that leads to the second question is, in the other parks, in our parks, do we intend to put some pollinator gardens in corners of existing parks so that there is a pathway?
Yes, so see if I can go back here to the,
Yeah.
yeah. So I looked at this map, and I'm not exactly sure I was not part of how this was developed. And so what I think would work really well would be to take those strips, the parking strips along the streets between the sidewalk and the roads, and transform those into habitat. Right now you see a lot of dead grass, ivy, non-native plants in these things. The way that we know that pollinators move through the environment, they don't go very far, especially the smaller bees can only travel about 150 feet. And so you're looking for ways to connect these areas. So you're looking for ways that are not separated by 150 feet. If we can do something that's linear in nature, like a parkway strip, that's a good corridor. And we have a few of those in town. Not every street has one, but the streets that do have them are perfect candidates for this kind of work and this kind of enhancement. And the other question, so Darren has requested some design input on some places in Rinconada Park, and I'm happy to do those as well. So I'm working on a couple of different places in that park right now to design up some native habitat that would work in the Magic Forest area, and also along the chain link fence by the school. There's an area that we've already designed up that has pollinator habitat already. So we're on it.
I'm an absolute firm believer in this, and I really appreciate your effort. And I know just on Alma, there's a huge strip between the sidewalk and the road, and it used to have some plantings, and in some places they're still there between, like just north of San Antonio, for instance. And I hope that we can continue that. And I'm a firmer believer because for the past 15 years, we've counted birds in the winter, and we have a native plant garden with maybe 30 species or 40 species, and there are birds that come down from the foothills and birds that come in from the baylands in the winter that use ours. So I'm sure that if there were 20 or 30 or 40 more gardens like that, that it would be a big success. Thank you.
Commissioner Cribbs? Commissioner Rechtel?
Marvelous. Thank you. Thank you for all your work. This is really an asset to the community. How much labor is involved? Once they're established, do you have to go in and weed and replant, or they just pretty much, you plant them and they're native and they succeed by themselves?
It really depends on the particular garden and how determined the ivy is to come back. But that decreases over time. What we have found in most of the gardens that most of the plants survive very well. There is some initial weeding that takes place, but we do mulch pretty heavily, so the weeds come out fairly easily. So for example, the primrose garden, which has been in place now for almost 4 years, I go out there maybe once a month with a group of volunteers, and we go after the weeds there. But that garden is very wild, and it's mostly an annual plant garden. The Island Drive garden is also very low maintenance. We try to do a lot of best practices kinds of things. So like, for example, we really try to hold back on pruning and deadheading. And most people say do it during the winter when the activity is low, but no, we like to wait until the overwintering insects have already emerged, and then we prune. So there isn't a ton of work to do in these gardens, because I really look at them as habitat gardens, which means hands off except to remove the weeds. So not a ton, but it can add up over time.
Which is also good in the sense that if you can do that, then that scales much better. If it's labor intensive, then you're really limited to how far you can spread.
Exactly.
Do you usually have annuals that reseed, or do you have perennials, or what do you usually plant?
So the primrose garden is the sort of experimental annual spot. Annuals can be unruly children because they like to go everywhere. And so to try to really keep some form and structure, I don't have many annuals in the other gardens. It's mostly perennials, shrubs, and small trees.
You mentioned irrigation. What happens if there's some spots, like in the traffic circles, where you don't have irrigation? Do you then hand water for that first year, or what do you do?
All of these gardens have existing spray irrigation.
Oh, that's very
which
nice.
is very handy. But we try to plant during the rainy season, which is the best time to plant during the year. It just is easier to dig holes, and the ground is moist, and the plants establish better. And we initially start with some irrigation to get the gardens established, and then we slowly cut it way back.
So if you found some locations without irrigation, would you have to put irrigation in, or?
That would be helpful.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, very, very wonderful. If you're looking for more land, have you been to Bixby Park? There's a little land there you could use. We do have some native species there, but there's a lot of open area. And baylands especially, along those walking paths, there's so much non-native there. But around town is probably the biggest bang for the buck. But anyway, thanks again. Wonderful.
It's a pleasure.
Commissioner McCauley?
Dr. Salisbury, thank you very much. This is awesome. I'm not sure whether you intended when you set out, and I think that the answer is you probably didn't intend when you set out to create such a great community around this, but I view that as probably one of the shining outcomes of this is the way that you've built community around it. I'm going to channel Dawn McDougall for just 1 second. Anyone who has had their ear bent by Dawn has heard about the idea of physical, social, and natural infrastructure, and you hit all three of them with these projects. It's awesome. So well done, and please keep it up.
Commissioner Lemaire?
Yes, I want to echo the sentiments of my other commission members, and thank you for doing this, and also compliment the city for allowing this to happen in a timely fashion. And I know we preach often, we need to find more public-private partnerships, but to see something like this happen is great. Hopefully we can get down into South Palo Alto at some point, and I know that the canopy there is a little bit less as well, and to be able to get South Palo Alto and have some of these plantings would be wonderful. I would also comment that and I don't know if there's resources available that you have or can guide people for private property owners that would want to participate in becoming, more savvy to the native planting, and if that's just something to, as easy as finding the Native Plant Society. But I would be interested in your comments about that. And then I have one question for Darren.
So for homeowners who are interested in transforming their backyards and front yards into more habitat-friendly gardens, I do speak for the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency just on these topics especially, and I will be giving a talk later this year. I believe it's in April at Mitchell Park Library on these topics, and we'll be talking about rebates for transforming your lawn as well. So that's certainly one way to go. One of the really great resources that we have here is the California Native Plant Society. They're a group of such dedicated professionals who are always advancing the cause and the science of these things. So those are a couple of places to start, certainly.
Great, thank you so much. And Darren, a quick question for you. In terms of when we do plantings, and so we had a speaker mention the Ross Road and the non-native plants that are planted there. What's our process of choosing what to plant, and what is our, how much do we consider, well, we need to have native plants here, or is there a thought with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's evolving. When we look at open space and park areas, it leans very, very heavily, in some areas 100% native plants. So for our 4,000 acres of open space, nothing gets planted but native plants. They're grown in our own nurseries, both by Save the Bay, down to Baylands, and Grassroots Ecology up at Foothills Park. In the urban park areas, it's a mix. We do have some that aren't native, but none that are invasive, But for other projects led by either transportation, sometimes it's a little less leaning towards those native varieties, and I think we're working to change that. Maybe Peter Jensen could speak to this a little bit later during his presentation, just a little bit about new documents that are coming out to give more guidance on what should be planted, and certainly native plants are going to be the dominant one we lean on. Same for our tree species, always dominant with the native oaks.
Commissioner Olson.
Dr. Salisbury, thank you for your labor of love. This is clearly something coming from your heart, and is so beautifully done. I'm really grateful for that. Piggybacking on the last commissioner's comment, I have a question. When you design the gardens here, are the designs then open sourced on the park site or somewhere where the public can access them? So if they have kind of a similarly shaped plot of land, they can already, maybe take advantage of your design to put in their own homes, kind of to your point?
So all of the gardens are open all the time, and we try to get as many labels as possible on the plants so that people can try to replicate what we do. I'm always looking for ways to educate people on how to do this. It's really not that difficult a process. We know how to enhance resources for pollinators. We know what the best practices are to protect insects. And so I'm always looking for ways to encourage people to look at the science. And I do post quite frequently science on our social media so that people can follow us there. So, but there's still nothing like the physical garden to go and see, and I'm happy to give people tours all the time and talk to them about how to do that. So it's become my mission in life.
Great. Well, thank you again. It really is something that's not just, practical and fixes a problem, it's also beautiful. So thank you again.
Thank you. So building on some of the comments of fellow commissioners, I really think this is a great example of a local grassroots effort to both build community and transform the community at the same time. So it's really inspiring. One of the first things I thought about, as well as others, was the potential synergy with the bulb outs from some of the traffic calming measures, and it is disconcerting to hear that there weren't natives put in there, and hopefully we can work more towards that. And Darren, I have a question. Does that come part more under the Urban Forestry Department, and could some of our potential synergies between the Commission and the Urban Forestry Department assist in this effort?
I think there's an element of that, our tie-in there, where it has specific programs, but we also have it in the Parks Master Plan. We'll have it in the Baylands Comprehensive Conservation Plan. So we've got the plans there. I think it's getting the message through to the contracted design firms and architects to say, we want native species here.
It sounds like we're really trying to transform our culture a bit.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments to look to build more towards South Palo Alto as well, and I know the planting strips are a perfect avenue. Unfortunately, we don't have the planting strips typically in South Palo Alto, so I'm wondering what other potential conduits you may be able to suggest for neighborhoods that don't have the planting strips.
So what we have found are really any sort of scrap pieces of land work, parking lots where there are perhaps some parking bay islands that are planted with non-native plants are one thing. Cul-de-sac islands are another avenue as well. And any sort of small strip of land can be planted with some kind of native plant. There's always a plant that will fit. With 8,000 to choose from, there's always a plant that will work.
Thank you. And finally, is there anything that the Commission can do specifically to assist this effort?
Well, if there are other areas that are lying fallow that could be enhanced, I'm happy to apply my design expertise. One of the things that really could be a very easy thing to do, I think, is to remove as much ivy as possible. It's not so much the planting that's hard, it's site preparation. And I think that once the ivy is gone, planting becomes kind of like the icing on the cake. It's pretty easy.
Thank you again for your efforts. Councilmember Koo, do you have any comments?
Thank you very much. It was just a beautiful presentation in the flowers, and I think the bugs were really great to see. I just wanted to ask Darren if you happen to know, by the creeks, like in Barron Park, where we have Matadero Creek, there's parts of it that belongs, I think, maybe to the county or to the Santa Clara Valley Water. Do we have any understanding with them in using those pieces of land? Because it's filled with ivy, it's crawling up the trees, and it would be lovely to have a nature garden over there too.
That's an excellent suggestion.
I don't know if we have any coordination with them.
Yeah, what we've done in the past, not such on a grand scale, but rather small sections of creek areas, not specifically in that spot, but along San Francisco Creek and a few other areas where grassroots ecology has said, hey, we'd love to come in and we'd like to restore this. And we've got some success stories that looked really good. Now it's just a matter of scaling it. And a key piece that Dr. Salisbury, I think, is underselling her incredible perseverance and gift to the city is sustaining it. So I've been part of a lot of native plantings from groups that would come in, and you can restore an area, and in about a year, unless you don't do anything to it, unless you keep coming back and taking care of it, it'll quickly revert to invasive weeds. I've seen that for the last 20 years here in Palo Alto. So it takes that sustained effort from really caring volunteers. And I think the way Dr. Salisbury is building this, where a neighborhood sort of adopts it, that's the same methodology we try to do in open space when we restore it. And that's the same thing I'd recommend when we do those creeks, is we engage that community to say, this is your patch of the creek, and you have to come year after year and care for it and love it.
That sounds great, and thank you so much for your service. And some of the neighborhood associations might be the way to go in getting them to participate and to care, take over the maintenance of it. Thank you again. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you again.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Commissioner Moss.
Two more comments. One is that the signage that you put out is so important for what Commissioner Lemaire and Olson said about being able to see what plants you could bring home to your own house, and also how they were arranged in a nice design, because some are bigger, you don't want them up close, some are, you want them back behind, et cetera. And then, so signage is really important in the places that you do it, and I'm so glad that you're doing that kind of thing, and just keep it up. And then the second comment is that a lot of these native plants have their own weed suppression chemicals in them, so that actually you do have a lot of maintenance, but not as much as with non-natives. So it's really important to let people know, maybe with signage, that it is a great way to do something without as many weeds as otherwise. And the last comment I'd like to make is that there are many churches in the neighborhood, like the Unitarian Church on Charleston has a native plant garden. Now that you're telling me about this, I noticed now in my mind that they've got a nice garden. So if all the churches in the city had a patch, that would be great. And going back to what Councilwoman Koo said, that if you can get the churches to own their plots, that's a great community builder. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to our next item, which is the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan and Matadero Creek Study Update. And Darren, I'll let you introduce our speakers.
Sure.
Good, thanks.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Tanner, Assistant Director for Planning and Community Environment, and with her is her consultant, Ben from WRA.
Okay, now we're in business. Good evening, members of the Park and Rec Commission. It's great to be before you this evening to talk about the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan. And as Darren said, I am the Assistant Director of the Planning and Development Services Department, and due to some staff departures, I'm also project managing the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight and to share with you an update, maybe an introduction for some of you. If you haven't been tracking the planning process, that's okay. We'll provide an overview of kind of where we are right now. A little bit about what we have planned for open space in the plan area, and then Ben's going to provide more detail about the Matadero Creek and how we've been researching what might be able to happen with the creek resource. So this is a map of the project area where the NVCAP is taking place. It's bounded by Page Mill, El Camino Real, Park Boulevard / Caltrain, and then also Lambert Avenue. So just outside of the boundaries of this particular 60-acre area are Bulwer Park and the newly purchased AT&T parcel, as we called it. Sarah Wallace Park is about an 8-minute walk away from the plan area. Pierce Park is about 25 minutes walking, and Hoover Park is about 30 minutes because you have to get over the Caltrain track. So if we were birds, we could get there a little quicker, but we can't. Of course, the Research Park is right south, kind of southwest of the plan area, and Cal Ave is just a few blocks away. So an area that many are familiar with, and perhaps most famously known for the Fry's, former Fry's building. Fry's, of course, closed at the end of last year. So another well-known kind of landmark there. So a background on the North Ventura Coordinated Area Planning process. This process began in November of 2017 when the council adopted a resolution expressing commitment to this project, and we pursued grant funds to support the project, Caltrans grant that's supported by the Federal Highway Administration. We were successful in achieving and being awarded those grant funds, and so in March 2018, the City Council approved goals, objectives, milestones, and plan boundaries and formed a working group. So we have a 14-member working group that is seated by members of the community. Includes a member from the Architectural Review Board, a member from the Planning and Transportation Commission. Keith Rechtel serves on it from your commission, so we're very glad to have him participating in the discussions, as well as folks who live in the plan area, folks who own property and are kind of a small and a larger developer. So really trying to get a diverse section of people who together can envision the area, but also folks who have a real stake in the future of the area. And so that group has been meeting since April of 2018 is when they were formed and appointed by the council. And then in June 2018, we selected our consultant, Perkins & Will, who really are the lead on helping design the plan. In October 2018, we kicked off the project and have had a variety of stakeholder meetings, a community workshop, a joint town hall with City Council, and in total 11 working group meetings from October 2018 until January of 2020. These are the project goals. There are 7 of them that council adopted when they kind of accepted that we were going to do this plan, form the plan boundaries, and charged us to go ahead and look at contracting with a consultant. And so they include housing and mixed use, transit, pedestrian, and bicycle connections in the plan area, connecting the street grid, ensuring that we have community facilities and infrastructure in the new plan area, that we balance the different community interests in the plan area. We consider urban design, design guidelines, and the neighborhood fabric, as well as sustainability and the environment. And they also adopted project objectives. In the interest of time, I won't read them all, but we'll ensure that you all can have access to them if that's something you'd like to go deeper into. And so we have our consultant, Perkins & Will, and at the end of December, they presented us with 3 project alternatives. And so kind of just a little insight into how we're seeing this process unfold. We want to create 3 draft plan alternatives that each kind of look at different aspects of what could the future of this neighborhood look like as it unfolds over the next 10, 20 years. And so we plan to study these 3 alternatives so we can compare them against one another. What are the benefits of approach 1 versus approach 2 versus approach 3, and we can really refine them with the hope being that we get to one preferred alternative that we can present to City Council, have their feedback, and ultimately buy in and saying, this is the preferred alternative that we'd like to move forward with, and then draft an area plan that brings that preferred alternative into our city's planning code. So part of the planning process includes ensuring that we are planning for adequate open space and really abundant open space. One of the things that has really emerged from the working group that I think is a really strongly held and widely shared value is the value of open space, having access to it, making sure that as more neighbors and more residents are accommodated, that there is adequate open space. And not just for the folks who live there, but maybe folks in the neighborhood who are going to be coming to the open spaces here, visitors, workers, people commuting through, that there really are gathering spaces as well as active and passive recreational spaces. So the consultants have recommended kind of 3 types of open space. One is called centralized, which is essentially what you might think of as a typical park, a larger open space that's kind of gathered together, so providing more ample room to move around. Greenways, which I'm very glad I was here for Dr. Salisbury's presentation, ways that we're connecting connecting so that we don't just have sidewalks that are nice, but really are providing a connection to open space, connection to nature as we're walking through the neighborhood. And then lastly, green roofs and courtyards. So ensuring that if there may be privately owned but publicly accessible open space, maybe there are plazas that have some green amenities, maybe there are rooftop gardens, some of those may be open to the public, some of those may be open only to the residents there, but again, ensuring that balance and mix of private open space for residents, but also publicly accessible open space. So these diagrams show the open space throughout the 3 proposed alternatives, the draft alternatives. And so you can see as the development is increasing, the amount of open space is also increasing for each alternative. You can see the green kind of popping up as on rooftops. A lot of it is centered around the creek, which is one of the reasons we have a creek study going on. We really see that as an asset, and how can we turn Matadero Creek into an asset for the neighborhood, for the entire city of Palo Alto. Right now it's channelized, it's kind of forced out of its natural pattern, and what can we do to restore some of the natural creek elements? So the Matadero Creek study, we really have gotten a lot of interest both from City Council as well as from the working group in studying it, which led us to consult with WRA to study creek naturalization. And the analysis that they're performing, we really understand it to kind of be answering the question, what will it take to naturalize the creek under 3 levels of intensity? One would be a full naturalization. If we were gonna roll back the development and say, let's take the creek back to how it naturally wants to flow, what would that look like? Okay, what if we were able to do it partially? What would some partial naturalization look like? What would that take? And finally, if we were gonna stay within the easement area that surrounds the creek, what would that take? And so that's the kind of minimal naturalization scenario that Ben is going to talk about all 3 of these scenarios tonight. I think one thing that's important to say is that there are certainly many folks who would like to see the creek become fully naturalized, and Ben is researching what that would take from an engineering perspective, what are the technical specifications that are required, and giving us some high-level cost estimates for construction at least. That doesn't include permitting, and that doesn't include the cost for design and some other elements that would be pretty costly as well. But there are other costs, the opportunity cost of naturalizing the creek. So if we were, for example, to choose the most fully natural option, that would limit the ability to have housing on what's currently 340 Portage, the Fry's site, because a lot of what's currently the parking lot would become the creek and not a great place to build housing. Likewise, if naturalization were to occur on parts of the park, that could basically take away all the parkland, or even what's conceived as open space in some of the diagrams, and so the space for passive or active recreation gets traded off for the naturalization of the creek. Furthermore, the Santa Clara Valley Water District has an easement for the creek, but they don't actually own the land through which the creek flows. And so this creek is crisscrossing privately held land and also crisscrossing through Bulware Park and the soon-to-be added extension of Bulware Park, which is publicly owned land, but again, that trade-off. So these are things that we really have to consider, that it would take not just money and not just effort, but it would take the purchase of private land, it would take negotiating those purchases, and it would take us saying, we believe that we want to naturalize versus maybe pursue some of the other opportunities that these parcels present. So those are things that we're hoping to get your feedback on this evening, kind of how you see some of those trade-offs, questions you might have regarding the creek, as well as comments on the open space, where you see opportunities maybe to do something innovative with the open space in the plan area, both along the creek but in other parts of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben Snyder from WRA. He is our engineer and project manager, and he has 15 years of experience working on projects like these. He's worked in neighboring communities like Hillsborough. He even did a project here in Palo Alto on our own San Francisco Creek, and has also worked in Corte Madero and Concord, so lots of experience here in the Bay Area. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Rachel. Can we queue up my PowerPoint? Okay, great, thank you. Again, my name is Ben Snyder. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you all today and tell you about the work we've been doing on studying Matadero Creek and looking at what's possible in this short reach of the creek mostly downstream of El Camino Real and upstream of Park Boulevard. So in my brief presentation this evening, I'll give you a brief update on what we've done since November, a little discussion about the outcomes of our planning process. We've held 2 working group meetings with the NVCAP working group, as well as a charrette to get input from the public and from the NVCAP working group on what the public really wants to see done with Matadero Creek, so that we can really focus our efforts on developing these conceptual designs. I'll give you a discussion of the different alternatives that we've developed and provide you some of the results of our hydraulic modeling and finally our cost estimates. So we're making pretty good progress on our project and our study now. The planning, I would say, is about 100% complete. We have a really good definition now of what the problems, opportunities, objectives, and constraints are for Matadero Creek, at least in this little reach. We visited the site and performed a site assessment using data that was provided by the City of Palo Alto and by Valley Water related to Matadero Creek, including as-built drawings of the creek and a hydraulic model developed for the Federal Emergency Management Agency to define the 100-year floodplain. We've defined the alternatives now. We've developed an alternative that was basically a no-action alternative, an alternative that has a minimum amount of footprint, and then 2 kind of middle-of-the-road alternatives, and then finally the full naturalization, which I'll go over in a minute. We've been performing hydraulic modeling of each one of these concepts to evaluate what impact on the 100-year flood would be by changing the geometry of the channel and introducing native vegetation and these things that make a creek natural, but also make it very rough and make it not as good of a conveyance for flood flows, because we want to balance these competing interests of naturalization and habitat value with the need for flood risk management. We're in the process of incorporating feedback from the city on the designs into conceptual drawings, and then finally we're documenting the work that we've done with the analysis and cost to have a memo to provide to the city. So alternative 1 is the minimum extent project with still having some renaturalization effort. And this would work within the boundaries of the current Santa Clara Valley Water District easement, which is roughly 60 feet wide. And this would extend from Lambert Bridge to the Park Boulevard Bridge. And here you have a plan view of this section of the creek. And this is rotated 90 degrees from north. So you're seeing from upstream to downstream going from right to left. So what this would do would be, this would have a channel that's widened from 30 feet to 60 feet. And the concrete walls would be replaced with a sheet pile wall. And the extra width would allow for native vegetarian planting of native vegetation and incorporation of recreational access, so we could have walking paths through this reach of the creek. And there would be a considerable improvement in the value of this reach of creek from the existing condition, which is essentially simply a rectangular concrete channel. We could at least renaturalize the bed of Matadero Creek and create a connection between the community and the creek for this reach. Here's a section view of alternative 1. The existing section is shown in a dashed line, and the proposed view is overlaid on top of that. So as you can see, we're essentially doubling the width and increasing the amount of space available for planting of native vegetation and allowing public access. Flood walls would be required. You see on the top of the cross-section, flood walls higher than the existing top of bank would need to be constructed to mitigate impacts to flood risk by incorporating these additional roughness elements of trees and shrubs and other vegetation. Thanks. Alternative 2 would work in the same reach of creek from Lambert Bridge to Park Boulevard through the 340 Portage property. This would widen the bed the same amount, but then also lay back the left bank if you're facing downstream at a 3-to-1 horizontal to vertical slope. So this would add additional space for planting and beautification of the space and allow for greater public access. Alternative 2, you can see the plan view here. It's essentially the same footprint as alternative 1, but with additional real estate being taken on the left bank to allow for that additional slope where it's laid back. But there would still be access for maintenance vehicles. One of the things that we learned from communicating with Valley Water was some of the requirements that they would have if we were to do any kind of a project here. And so all of these alternatives would be meeting the requirements of Valley Water. One of those is continued access for maintenance to the creek. Another is no increase in flood risk. And no increased cost to Valley Water for maintenance were the main issues. And then here's a section view of alternative 2. So you can see it's similar to alternative 1, but with additional space with the left bank being laid back. And alternative 2A would be essentially the same as concept 2, but would also include an additional reach upstream in Boulevard Park. So what we're doing is expanding that reach, the renaturalized creek, into the park with this essentially the same cross-section geometry as downstream in 340 Portage, but an additional approximately 500 feet of creek adjacent to the park. So people in the park could then walk down into the creek corridor underneath Lambert Boulevard Bridge and then down to the 340 Portage site and then connect over to Park Boulevard. So there would be a recreational corridor that connects the park over to the other part of the city. And alternative 3 is the full renaturalization, or at least as fully renaturalized as can be in the urban constrained site that Matadero Creek currently is in. But we think this is probably the maximum amount of ecological value that could be provided to Matadero Creek or to the corridor by taking this approach. This would also have vertical walls to maximize the amount of space available for natural creek function, geomorphic function, and vegetation. It'd be roughly 3.5 times the existing width, so about 100 feet wide, a little over 100 feet wide. And this would have a meandering low-flow channel going from bank to bank within this corridor. A large part of the undertaking with alternative 3 would be replacing the Lambert Bridge with a completely new span that would allow for the creek to be able to meander through the bridge and not be constrained by the relatively narrow, roughly 30-foot width. But this would require a significant investment in real estate because this would be well outside of the easement of, that Valley Water currently has. Here's a plan view for alternative 3, showing the additional footprint of renaturalization area. Thank you for doing that. And here's a section view. So kind of similar in geometry to alternative 1, but now just much wider. Oh, sorry, section. Okay. Right, okay. And now we're giving the creek lots of room to be able to meander back and forth within this corridor and function the way that creeks function. Next slide, yeah. This is a longitudinal profile view of model output, showing what the difference in 100-year backwater profile is for existing conditions compared to the design conditions. And so you can see that the filled-in blue area is existing, and then the line above it between Park Boulevard and Lambert Avenue is the design condition. So you can see that the water surface elevation is higher, and this is the increase in water surface elevation that would be mitigated with raising the flood walls. This would be required as far upstream as to El Camino Real along that reach for any one of the alternatives.
Can you say that again? What's required up to El Camino?
Flood walls on top of the channel bank of approximately 2 feet in height. So these flood walls could be somewhat recreational in form and function, meaning that it could be a place for people to sit that, in addition to providing this flood risk mitigation. I don't want you to be picturing like a 10-foot high border wall or something. So, thank you.
But isn't, when you go west of the park, isn't that a culvert? Isn't the Boston Market, doesn't it go under the parking lot?
Upstream of
the park?
Yes, it's essentially a long box culvert upstream.
And so would that have to be touched at all, or is just everything up to that point?
Just up to that point.
Okay, thank you.
Based on each one of these designs, we've gone through line by line and looked at what the costs for implementation would be, starting with an analysis of the quantities of work, of materials required for each one of them. Demolishing the existing channel, hauling off concrete, doing earthwork to widen the channel, and then installing the new project elements in order to come up with what these totals would be. Alternative 1, naturally, is the least expensive, as it has the least amount of earthwork and requires no real estate acquisition primarily. And we estimate this could be done for under $4 million. Alternative 2 would require acquisition of part of the 340 Portage parcel, and with real estate in this area valued at $10 million an acre, that adds significantly to the cost of this project, as well as the additional earthwork of laying back the left bank. And so the alternative 2 estimate is about $7.4 million. Alternative 2A, with the same approach, but with additional 500 feet of length through the park upstream, would be about $10 million. And alternative 3, including the rather expensive improvement and widening of the Lambert Avenue Bridge, would be in the vicinity of $45 million. And again, as Rachel mentioned, these costs don't include design, permitting, or construction management, but they do include a 25% contingency.
So that is the conclusion of our presentation, just kind of some next steps that we're hoping to get feedback from this commission this evening. And we'll also be having a community workshop on February 27th, 2020 around the overall NVCAP plan. And we hope to begin public hearings, taking it to the Planning and Transportation Commission, the Architectural Review Board, and then also to the City Council this spring. So we're available for questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Again, we have a couple of public speakers. Does any Do any commissioners have any clarifying questions before we go to the public comments? I do have one quick question. The construction costs, which you were just itemizing for us, do those not include land purchase costs as well? So if it's necessary to purchase property, that is not included in the construction cost estimate?
These do include real estate acquisition.
They do include real estate acquisition?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that was assuming 10 million an acre.
10 million an acre, that's helpful, thank you. Okay, our first speaker will be Shawnee Kleinhaus, inviting you back up here, followed by Ken Joy.
Good evening, Shani Kleinhaus from Audubon again. I did not participate in the meeting, but some of our members did, and I can see the results, and they did a good job. In Cupertino, Stevens Creek, in the area of Blackberry Farm and what they call the Stockholmeyer property, was in a similar condition. Some of it was very urban, some of it was still orchards. And they did a beautiful restoration project there, which is the gem of Cupertino. So many people go there to enjoy the wildlife, the birds, everything that they've done there. The project was paid for primarily from Prop 68 and the Water District. So don't let the numbers scare you. The money is available for things like this. It really is. And just think about doing something very, very special that is so rare and so unique and so beautiful. So go for the maximum you can get here. Do the restoration, it will serve people. We can get buildings that will be a little higher to provide a little more space. I think the city will be open to that. I think we can, so if we want more housing, maybe we do another story and provide some really, really good value, ecological value to the community. Sport field and things can even go on a roof. I mean, there's things we can put that don't require the land. You can't put a creek somewhere else. You just can't. Look what they've done to them. They put them in boxes. I remember my neighbor over near Adobe, I guess it's Adobe, and it's in a culvert, and she said that they used to have all these frogs there. Tell me when you've seen a frog last time, anywhere in Palo Alto. So go for the max. Look at what they've done to Blackberry Farm, and it'll give you an idea of what can be done here. Maybe it is a little less restricted there, but the parking lot went all the way to the creek. So I hope you do. In any case, any creek, any lengthy place that is not necessarily the traffic, but creates that sort of continuity, should be the continuity for the pollinators, for the birds. Always plant the trees there. Even if you have a flood wall, plant the trees behind the flood wall. Make sure that we have the continuity for the birds and the bugs everywhere that we can create it, in little patches, in long stretches. Always try to think, where can I put a few oak trees, some native plant gardens, a few of the gardens that the first presentation provided. I'm just going to say, we did a BioBlitz. BioBlitz is where you bring a lot of people, and they bring their phones and take pictures of things, and everything that is alive. Rocks don't count, but anything else. And then iNaturalist can tell you what you see if you don't know what it is, or it gives you more background. So Palo Alto did a few of those in the Baylands. And there was a little boy about 5 years old, and he found a snail. And so he had the snail crawl on his hand. He's never seen any wildlife as exciting as that. And the kid had a smile like from ear to ear, and he was so happy. And you think about what our children are missing when a kid is so happy to see a snail. So just saying that nature trumps everything else, sorry to use that word.
Thank you. Ken Joy.
Thank you for coming tonight. I have a couple of questions. I picked up a handout on the table there that's dated December 5th, NVCAP Working Group meeting that is similar to the slide you showed, but not exactly the same. One question I had, there's a page in this that shows the various cross-sections next to each other, which is very useful, but I don't know where on the map those cross-sections would be shown. You know, if you prepare slides like this in the future, it'd be great if you could give people an idea of where that cross-section appears on the map. The other question I had to do with the numbers you gave on your construction cost estimate. You talked about how many dollars it would be, but you didn't specifically say how many acres of land would be taken under each of those scenarios. And when I look at the alternative 3 here, I see that there's land on both sides of the creek, and I'd be very curious to know how many property owners are affected and what proportion of each of their parcels is affected by eminent domain for alternative 3. I mean, I certainly agree that it's very attractive to consider that, but what's the real implication there? Thank you.
Thank you. Comments from commissioners? Commissioner Olson?
I have various thoughts. I didn't see on the, designs 2 through 4, I guess, it looked, well, 4 is different, right? It's completely different, but 2, 2A, and 3, where there's that widening, it essentially looks like the first drawing, but then there's sort of this angled area. Is that essentially the difference? Like, it's not a walking path, it's more of just kind of a slope? Is that what the difference is there?
Yes, and that slope will have a path that goes up from the creek, so running kind of diagonally up the slope to allow recreational access down into the creek, and then ornamental plantings along the slope.
And so before and after this project, there's no, going along the creek, you literally kind of come down and out. How long is that stretch distance-wise when you're coming down and then going back out? I'm just trying to get a sense of this. Is this like a 2-minute stroll that's not really providing a lot of value versus like this is a good 15-minute?
Right. Let's see. I think it's about roughly 1,000 feet.
And is that on both the, within the project area and the park stretch? Or like if you were starting from the park and then ending at Park Boulevard, do you have approximately how long that walk would be in feet maybe?
Yeah, I believe total that would be roughly a third of a mile. So 10 minutes or something.
Okay.
It is a relatively small stretch of creek that we would be addressing.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have for now.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I do have a couple questions. One, is there creek restoration built in? Like, do we need to restore the creek as we're doing this, and that is built into the price as well? I know when we looked at Buckeye Creek, for example, the cost to actually restore it is very expensive. Are we looking at that as well with this in that price?
That's included in the price.
Okay, that's in the price as well. And then as far as funding sources, do we have funding sources already identified with this project, or how do we go about that?
Well, I can say we are certainly open to looking at grant sources. I think the particular extent of this project was to try to see what's feasible, and with that, to include some level of creek restoration, hopefully in the project plan, in the overall area plan. It could be that this becomes a community benefit, that as developers hopefully build housing or other uses in the area, that there may be impact fee or something that could help go towards restoration. There's also been discussion of maybe we could do some type of benefit district so that there are funds generated within the district that go into this particular use. And as the speaker said, and as we know from other creek projects, there are funds available that we could be competitive for if we did develop, go from a conceptual design to a more refined design that could be funded hopefully with some grant dollars.
And then with projects such as these, what are some of the maintenance costs or maintenance that needs to be done that would be regular and annual that has to happen?
Each year, some of the vegetation would likely need to be cut and thinned so that doesn't completely reduce the flood conveyance capacity of the channel. So that's probably a hand crew working for maybe roughly a week once a year to do that work. I can't do that math quickly enough in my head to tell you what that would be.
And then as far as to reference our last speaker, in terms of properties that are taken in that, looking at that third proposal, how many residential properties are impacted, and what other sort of properties are impacted with it? Is it only parking lots? Is it businesses? What type of properties?
The property is upstream of Lambert. It's all city-owned property. It's the park and the newly acquired parcel 3350, I don't remember this. And then downstream of Lambert is primarily the 340 Portage parking lot. But then there are some other parcels on the right bank that are commercial properties. And there's one right downstream of Lambert Avenue on the left bank if you're facing downstream. I don't know the disposition of that property. It may be a small office building just downstream. So that could potentially be avoided by shifting over to the right side, to the north side, and maintain that same corridor width, but avoid that one parcel.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Ryan?
Thanks very much for the presentation. You definitely have a bunch of different and difficult trade-offs to think about, and so your job is not easy here. Rachel, maybe you can speak to the broader planning process for the North Ventura area and whether or not any of these creek restoration projects are necessarily coupled with the broader planning process, or if there's the opportunity for this to happen even if some of the other goals for NVCAP don't happen.
That's a great question. I think that there are certainly kind of parallel projects. They don't necessarily need to be coupled in the sense that, let's say, I mean, the nature of the long-range plan is to set out, here's our vision for how this area might develop over, the next decade or two. And so it is by nature a slow-moving to become enacted. Whereas this creek project, both due to the relatively short stretch that it is, and if grant funds were available or other funds were available, perhaps that could happen at a different timeline. Maybe buildings are developing over 10 years, but maybe this is a project that becomes a capital project for the city, and we decide as a community we want to, undertake it at a different pace. That could certainly happen. I think where there's really a strong connection is around how any kind of proposed plan we might choose would impact the properties, the private properties, and then what we can happen on those. So if, for example, a property owner is saying, oh great, my one-story car repair place, for example, that's one of the buildings there, can now be housing at a scale that makes sense. Maybe I'll sell it, I'll retire from my car repair business, sell my land, and it can become housing. If that, however, is kind of saying, well, maybe it's going to be eminent domain to become a creek, that might diminish folks' desire to invest in housing on that site. And so I think where we really see the dovetailing of these projects is kind of deciding what level of restoration would we want to pursue, and that way, funds could be raised for that level of restoration, and other parts of the plan could kind of settle in around it. I also think that the way the open space has been developing in the vision for this plan is really centered around the creek as being this asset that we want to connect people to, and Portage Street, an idea has come to try to have more small-scale retail along Portage, almost like a small main street of the area, then kind of leads up to this creek and this park. So I think that's been important to the working group, and something, again, that I think we have some consensus around. So that's where I think the the alternative one, although modest in its ecological benefits compared to some of the other ones, uses the available easement that is already going to be maintained and kind of helps to balance some of those trade-offs. Hopefully that answers your question, but I'm happy to discuss more.
Yeah, it does, and I appreciate that response. So, did you want to actually receive some feedback from us this evening on?
That would be great, yes.
On alternatives. So,
and I would say in particular, given your next item, which is Bulware Park, we are loath as a planning department to say what shall happen in a park and, that it should become a restored creek. So we definitely want to understand what your perspectives or questions or concerns might be.
So, one piece of feedback for you is that all of these alternatives, 1 through 3, including 2A, provide pedestrian and bike access, which I think is really important. I'm sure that you've heard that from all of the stakeholders thus far. So both the further naturalization of the space as well as having that pedestrian bike path, I think, is really critical. So then as I start to look at the other alternatives, certainly it would be wonderful to have the added elements that each alternative provides, but I'm not sure that the marginal gain is necessarily worth it, right? So going from 60 feet to 85 feet is a pretty significant addition, and certainly the costs and the other issues that you've identified with alternative 3 would seem to make it probably very difficult. It doesn't seem like it would be the most pragmatic alternative from my perspective. I would love it if we could do that, but I just don't know that we will be able to. To think about 2A, which I think would be very cool if it were feasible. And again, 2A is essentially extending this naturalization of the creek up to Bulware Park. I'm really interested to hear from Peter after you about how that would impact the park and the amenities, the resources within the park. But that would seem to be the most natural way, from my perspective, as I think about it tonight, to make it a cohesive, continuous space that is longer than a football field. At least it would be a football field and a half, right? Or maybe 2 football fields even, if we went through the entire park. So it seems like having that third mile connection that continues through the park would be, as I sit here now, the preferred alternative from my perspective. So that would be 2A.
And I think I want to ask Ben, I think that alternative,
me.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just to clarify slightly, 2A, but perhaps you would consider alternative 1 all the way through the park.
And I believe that we did have some slides previously. I think we were trying to pare down, but there is a way to extend alternative 1 through the park, which again then balances kind of taking recreation space, but still having a connection to the creek. I think we had looked at that earlier.
Can I ask a question about that? If that were the case, would there be any eminent domain of people's homes in that scenario? That was a no, correct?
Yeah, I think that we would cross over Lambert and then the park that's right there, so we wouldn't need to take any real estate from any other private properties if we were to extend alternative 1A through both the extension of Bulware Park and Bulware Park itself. And again, that's staying within the current easement of the creek for alternative 1.
Thank you.
David?
So the 2 examples that I know of in the neighborhood are the Stevens Creek between El Camino and 101, and that is quite an extensive path through down at the river level, and I don't know how they close it at high water time, but we'll have the same situation where do we let people down in there when there's high water? How do we keep people out, or how do we prevent people from getting washed down under Alma? What do we think about that?
I think it's certainly an issue. Do you want to speak? I'm not sure if you're familiar with other ways that the Water District handles access at challenging times, if it would just be that we'd close the access, have a fence or a gate that's available to be closed?
An example comes to mind in the Valley Water portfolio, and that's the Guadalupe River Trail, which runs all through San Jose. And there's several places along there where it passes underneath overcrossings that would be inundated during a flood event. I don't recall seeing any signage in those areas, even during flood events. So I don't know that there is an existing Valley Water protocol for addressing public access. But I think it could be part of the operations and maintenance plan for this project, should it go forward, to have signage displayed, at least during storm events, or potentially year-round, just letting people know of the dangers.
Okay. Then the second place is between Wilkie and Mountain View and Monroe. There is a bridge, pedestrian and bike bridge, that is cantilevered out over the top of the channel. And so going back to alternative one, which is the least expensive, is that what you're proposing we could do without without buying land on either side?
I'm just going to bring it up on the screen so that we can make sure we're all looking at it. We'll maybe look at this section. So I want to say, I don't believe any of these propose cantilevering at this point. However, that was something that has come up, kind of this discussion of, right now you can see the little man individuals down there in the creek, and you can see someone also walking along the top that's at grade with the other buildings. And so that was a discussion of what might be most desirable. Providing access for people to get close to the water and really experience nature is a great value, but then they are kind of sunk in. And so would we want to cantilever something over, or would we want to have it at the grade of the creek? We do need to provide the maintenance access already, so there's kind of some thought, since we're already building a path for cars in the creek, why not build a path that people can also walk on in the creek? And so maybe there's both. Maybe there's walking path above and walking path below. But these proposals don't include cantilevering at this point.
Okay, because I would love to be able to walk at the creek level 99% of the time. So if that's at all possible, even within the current confines of the creek bed, so that would be wonderful. And obviously, I would prefer to start with the Boulware Park section because that's public land on either side. Well, no, on one side, giving you a lot cheaper solution, and then extending below the Lambert Bridge as far as you could pay for it. That's all I have.
Great, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for all of this. Could you go back to the costs of the different, and then just to confirm, what's the percentage you kind of factor in for the design and permitting and all of that? Did I understand you to say 25%, or was that the contingency?
That was the contingency.
Okay.
Design and permitting hasn't been factored into this.
So isn't there kind of a rule of thumb about kind of what costs you can kind of crank into that?
Yeah, design.
Not that we're going to hold you to it, but.
The rule of thumb I use for design is roughly 10% of the implementation cost.
Okay.
And permitting, maybe 5 to 10 also.
And then the construction management?
Maybe another 5. So maybe another 25% on top of what this is.
Yeah, getting up there.
Yeah.
And these are in today's dollars, so, right?
Correct.
So how long do you think until this project is ended? Could you even think about that? What's the estimated time?
The time that it would take to construct the project
Yeah.
if construction were to
And you're
begin.
starting to construct.
Yeah, do you have a sense of, let's say alternative one, maybe start how long that particular type of scale would take, or in months, or?
I would expect that alternative one could be implemented in a single dry season, so over the course of a summer. And probably a phased approach would be good to do the upstream, or maybe as Mr. Moss was saying, do the upstream portion first, and then as a second phase, do 340 Portage the following year. I think in terms of timeline, if we were to start right now, I think we could probably expect to implement in the next 5 years.
Lightning speed at government, so.
And then what's your sense, are we getting a sense yet of the community and what restoration plan they prefer? Has that come up yet?
It has. I think you're getting the more full presentation. What we did with the working group was present the 3 alternatives. We didn't have the cost estimates at that time, and so we did get some initial feedback. I would look to Commissioner Rectal to kind of add his sense from the working group. I think there's a mix of folks, and also from the public, some who really want to see full restoration, and that's their top priority. I would say the majority of folks want to balance the interests of restoration with the other things that they'd like to see happen in the area. We were, I think, pleasantly surprised to and happy to hear that there's a soft bottom restoration project going on with the Water District in Mountain View right now that this kind of is modeled after. So that gave us hope of feasibility, right? Not just coming up with something we think is feasible, but the Water District has been open to with other communities. And so that gave us also encouragement for alternative one to be able to balance interest. But I wouldn't want to say that I can speak fully on behalf of all members of the community.
And then finally, at what point when the Water District comes in and says yes or no, and you can do this and you can't do this, do they get to kind of say their final say so that we don't get all the way through it and then have them?
Yeah, so we want to make sure that as Ben is preparing his final report and memo, that we are getting their buy-in to the degree that we can. Obviously, they're very high-level concepts, and so if they can at least conceptually meet the needs that the Water District has laid out, that hopefully will be satisfactory for them. And I think if it's meeting the hydrological standards and the flood risk standards that the Water District has laid out. That being said, as we were to go forward with, if we were going to go from concept to kind of a more schematic design, I imagine that they would be involved in a more engineering level review, and perhaps you can speak to that with some of your experience of how the Water District might engage with the actual permitting process.
They've been really helpful in communicating with us throughout our process. Good. And one of the questions we had for them was whether or not it would be a non-starter, us increasing water surface elevations during a design event. And the indication from them was that they would consider supporting the design and construction of increased flood walls upstream of our project. So it's not a non-starter. So that was encouraging. And having the clarity they provided in their comments as we were beginning this effort regarding what there needs to be, I think has been really helpful in directing our process. And I would imagine we would give them an opportunity to review the memo that I developed for you, and then if the city were to choose to move forward, to continue to have periodic check-ins with them, an opportunity to review a draft 30% plan set would be standard at the same time of engaging other resource agencies. I would probably invite Valley Water to be a part of that panel of resource agencies that would have CDFW, the Corps of Engineers, and other stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Keith?
Yeah, I would concur with Rachel's assessment that there is big support in the neighborhood for naturalizing. We had an early survey where this was the #1 thing that they wanted, more than parks and the developments. They really liked naturalizing. When we went through and showed these 3 alternatives, I think overall people liked alternative 3 the best. There was some concern like, oh, we're losing a lot of parkland, so we would have to trade that off, and I think the people have to see what do they get from that. But you know, the alternatives 2 and 3 were probably the most popular. We didn't have the slide. I was really excited until I hit the slide, and then I was brought back down to reality.
No, right.
We have Buckeye Creek up in Foothills Park that needs a lot of work. We're getting a lot of erosion up there, and that's on the order of 10 million, and we just can't find any place to pay for that. And so I don't know how we're going to, even alternative 2A, which I love, I don't know how we're going to swallow that. So maybe we're going to be stuck with an alternative 1A, like Ryan said, is having a simpler one that goes through, that but also includes a park. I think that would be probably the best thing, but we can see if we can get some grants to do alternative 2A. I think that'd be wonderful. I want to confirm that on all these options, you showed pictures of the man on the side. No one was in the water. There'll be public access all the way down into the water. So if kids want to go into the water and play, correct. Okay. Yeah, because my kids, we would go up to Shoot Park in Los Altos and spend hours up there. And I'd have to beg them to come home because they would be having so much fun up there. So I think that'd be a really good asset to the community to have kids be able to go play. You showed that cross-section of the stream. Can you show that, the elevation? And I don't remember which slide that was on. Here we
For
go.
which alternative? This one?
No, the previous one, the one with the...
Oh, yeah, with the water?
Yes. So on the far right, that's El Camino, and it really looks steep there. After it crosses El Camino, it really dives. Does the flow have a lot of velocity there, or are we going to get scouring if we don't have concrete on the bottom? If we just have soil there, will we actually be kind of eroding away the soil to do that velocity coming downhill?
That's a good question, and there will be significant velocity and shear stress, which would have sediment transport capacity. But the bottom would likely be engineered with a mixture of gravel and cobble that would be resistant to erosion, but that would still allow for colonization by native vegetation.
Okay. And part of this also, we would be planting native vegetation in the creek bed?
Correct.
Okay.
I suspect that willows and other riparian plants would volunteer, recruit naturally pretty quickly as well.
Okay. So maybe this is a question for Darren, I'm not sure who. If we do go into the park and sacrifice some parkland to naturalize that, do we get some wetland credits for that? Do you know?
It might be a better question for WRA, but I would think you probably would, especially the area that they're looking at is mainly passive turf.
My expectation is that you would be able to get wetland credit for that.
Okay, that would be worth something. Do you know how much wetland credit? What is it, $1 million an acre?
I'm not sure.
I forget what we were quoted when we were looking at it. Okay. Yeah, I guess that's the only thing. I mean, I think this would be wonderful. I don't know if our pocketbook is big enough, but I think we should push forward and try to go for the big one, and if we can't, we scale it back. But
Speaking of that,
oops, your mic.
Well, I can't speak to this project. So the question was about who would pursue grants for this project. I think Rich will probably address that. I would speak more just for a similar project, which is the Buckeye Creek one. And I think for that one, it would be a combination of CSD and Public Works Engineering pursuing that if we don't hire a consultant to do it for us, a grant writer that pursues that for us.
If I may speak to that, I think that as someone from the public mentioned earlier, Prop 68 and Prop 1 grants might be a good source of funding for this. Also, depending on the age of the Lambert Avenue Bridge, there could be grant funding for replacing that as well, although I don't think that it's, I think I saw the date on it of 1990, so maybe a little too young for an infrastructure grant, but it might be something that's worth looking into.
Well, thank you, Rachel and Ben, for your presentation and for all of your efforts. This is a very exciting concept plan, and it's an opportunity to restore riparian environment, which we don't get very often. It does, as Keith had referenced, it does echo a similar plan we've had at Buckeye Creek and Foothills Park to restore a riparian environment that's not going anywhere, so it really is a concern. Hearing that there's community support broadly for the creek in this area is also very exciting and heartening. And I also appreciate that you clarified that creek access would be included for the plan, similar to Shoup Park. I know that that's something that a lot of families will really appreciate, and I know it's also going to be a concern for environmentalists in that walking and access into the creek is going to decrease the habitat value. So that's something we're going to have to sort out how we balance. My biggest concern is the overall timeline with the NVCAP project, the complexity of the project with so many disparate landowners, and trying to tie this plan in with so much unknown. And I'm kind of I appreciate that you're looking at a parallel process. I'm grateful that you've created the plan and done the research, and we have the data, so we have some information for how to move forward. But I feel like it's very difficult to assess trade-offs as you've asked us to at this what feels like very early stage, very, very early days. Yes, we're all very excited about the plan. We're all very concerned about funding. I think I've heard from a number of commissioners, the low-hanging fruit seems to be to develop the creek in Bulware Park, where we already own the land. That makes a lot of sense, and that seems like something that we should be focusing on and redirecting some of our efforts to consider, because that seems like something that we can move forward with. And it's also possible if that section of the creek were restored, there could be broader support and potential funding opportunities to work on the rest of the project, and it might sync up with the timeline that we're talking about. I'm not sure about that. So overall, I appreciate the effort. I'm excited about the opportunity, and there's a lot of concerns in these early days. Do any commissioners have any further comments? Yes, Jackie.
I have a couple of extra questions. I'd like a little bit more information on eminent domain, really just buys someone out at fair market value for their home. It doesn't necessarily help them find a new home at their tax base they're in, correct?
So again, we don't have to purchase any homes for either of these plans. They're all commercial buildings, and I will say I'm not a lawyer or an eminent domain expert. Okay. Eminent domain obviously is a very touchy subject when it comes to property owners, and so one might imagine that certainly if you may purchase fair market value, would they be able to buy a similar property to have their business in elsewhere in the city? Unknown. If they're a tenant business, would they be able to find similarly priced space for lease in the city? That would not be known and may be difficult. In addition to, the process to decide what the fair market value is and any litigation that may be part of that type of process. So that's not a straight answer for you, but certainly if it was a home, maybe the value would still be hard for someone maybe to relocate within the same community.
Okay, that's helpful. My other question is there any enhanced ecological value of going wider in the creek than going longer? And I'm trying to think about sort of the trade-offs between what we're now calling 1A, which is sort of the number one but extended longer. Does that have as much ecological value as taking that shorter strip and making it wider?
Do you want to speak to that, Ben?
Well, one of the things we're constrained with here is the road crossings and railroad crossings, and so that's one of the reasons why we haven't gone further longitudinally. And we're looking to create as much riparian and wetland acreage as we can, and so I'm not sure that I know quite how to address your question, whether there's a greater value in width versus length. One thing about having a wider corridor is that you're giving the creek more of an opportunity to have what we call geomorphic function, where it's eroding its own channel and moving back and forth from side to side within the corridor, and that additional width would allow for that. I think that there's some additional value in length in terms of community value, because as you were noting earlier, that it is kind of a short reach as it is, so if we can make it longer, then that provides greater recreational benefit. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
I think it does, yep. And I think, I tend to be relatively practical. To me, it does seem like there's not a huge benefit going off the ones until you get to that last design where it's like the full, project, and that just seems sort of awesome if money's no object, and if no one cares that their property's being taken and all of that. I just think that that's going to be such a big lift. So I do think that 1A, sort of that longer skinny project, seems much more feasible, but also provides a lot of benefits that we don't have today, and it looks like it'll be a really beautiful path, but I really like the idea of doing the long part and the stretch by the park first.
That's great.
I want to give one point about the eminent domain. First, most of the time eminent domain is actually going in and taking the house. Most of the time there's a deal ahead of time, so very rarely does it actually go to eminent domain and more. So you really shouldn't use the term eminent domain, you really should be talking about acquisitions. But the second thing is that in this case, if you're taking or acquiring the property, the Fry's parking lot, that developer likely would be happy to do that because they have open space requirements for whatever redevelopment they have, and that would be a credit towards their open space requirements. So some negotiations could be done. I don't think people are going to be going to court about this. So.
If you put dirt, natural bed, and that natural bed starts washing down downstream underneath Alma and on down through that next neighborhood down. Right now it's a culvert, cement, so now you're going to get dirt flowing down through there. Does that mean that culvert down there is going to have to be raised a foot to compensate?
Yeah, would we have to do any adjustments as it goes down underneath the train tracks on the other side, or that's accommodated for in their model that you have, the sediment movement?
My understanding is that Valley Water currently does sediment removal maintenance periodically, and I wouldn't anticipate that this reach would generate additional sediment. I would expect that there would be greater issues with sedimentation within this reach and more likelihood there, because the water is going to be, as someone was noticing, that looking at the longitudinal profile, that it's going to be high velocity coming into this reach, and then it's going to be decelerating. So you're losing sediment transport capacity, and there probably will be some sedimentation. And there could be some ways to be proactive in the design, thinking about maintenance considerations, and I think having some kind of a sill to act as a sediment retention structure could be a really good idea.
Thank you. It's getting close to 9:30, and we have another item on the agenda, but I wanted to give Councilmember Koo an opportunity to offer any council perspective, if she'd like.
I'll refrain from commenting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you again very much for your presentation and for being with us this evening, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is the Bulwer Park renovation project update. Peter Jensen is joining us. Welcome, Peter.
Peter, with my apologies, I have to depart. My daughter is at home, and her babysitter needs to go home as well. So,
Home alone?
I look forward to reviewing your report, though. Thank you.
While Peter is pulling up his presentation, I just want to take a chance to introduce him. We have some new commissioners, new faces that may not know him. Peter Jensen's the city's landscape architect with Public Works Engineering and partners very closely with Community Services, in particular the Parks Department.
Thank you, Darren. As Darren said, Peter Jensen, landscape architect for the city of Palo Alto. Good evening, commissioners. Nice to meet you, Ms. Olson, and nice to have a Councilmember Koo here as well. Going to review the first process of the Boulware and the AT&T site, or the Birch property site as it's called in the city, a development. We had a community meeting about that just recently to get some feedback, basically starting at a very preliminary level as we build up the design, and talk a little bit about the design tonight that was developed in part to provide some cost estimates to start the discussion about formulating a capital increase in budget for the whole area to devise a completed park space. So currently now a Boulware Park exists in the green highlighted section there now. It's defined by Ash Street on this side, which segments the new property from the old property. So this is in the yellows where the AT&T property is. Originally, this project was supposed to be just a renovation of the existing Boulware Park. Fortuitously, it was postponed for a year due to some budget shortcomings. During that time, the property across the street, the AT&T property, came up for sale. The city closed that sale or finalized that sale just a few months ago. We've basically been waiting for that to happen to start this process again for the design, as we knew that once the property was a dedicated parkland, which it is now, that of course the neighborhood would want to see that land developed into some usable park space. If you have not seen it currently, it is just an open lot, mostly non-native weed that have grown there and some non-native trees that need to have some attention paid to it. For the community meeting, what we did was had a meeting on a Saturday, invited the community out, and just really focused on trying to understand what the community would like to see as far as facilities in the park goes. Those facilities were basically shown on boards, and then the community was allowed to select their favorites, as well as prioritize the ones that they would like to see implemented first. As we discussed before with the project beforehand, of course, renovation of parks and the construction of new parkland is not a cheap thing to do. So there might be some stages or some phases of the park development that have to take place. So that was priority questions were there to understand basically what we should implement first if we had to break the project up into pieces. The facilities, the list was a combination of existing site facilities that currently exist in Boulware Park, and then facilities that are called out in the park master plan that are to be reviewed for every park renovation project. Things like shaded seating, loop pathways, adult fitness, things like that to implement into park space. Of course, we know in the Ventura area that park space is limited. It is one of the most densely populated areas of Palo Alto. So expanding the park land in this space is definitely a no-brainer, and I think that was the city should be congratulated on moving forward with adding the additional parkland. As we know in Palo Alto, that's not a very small economic feat to do. I've added a few slides from the packet that you got last week. This slide starts to show the results of that community survey, basically the sticker voting there. We've also ranked it from the what got the highest vote to the lowest vote in these. Again, there are two questions there. One is asking which facilities would you like to see in the park. The other one is basically taking that and asking which one would you most prioritize as having first if you're going to break it in phases, build these things first. So you can say that the most interesting number one thing is a restroom, which we talk about a lot at the commission. Always a hot button topic when you actually start to implement one in a park. The general consensus from the overall population of Palo Alto is that they would like to see more restrooms in the park. But of course, once you start to get into a specific park, sometimes those feelings change. It is nice to see, though, that within this park that is not the case itself. The restroom and having a restroom is actually something that the neighborhood cherishes, which should be brought up that area, especially along Ash Street for the community, has been some concern because there is some overnight parking that has occurred there before. I would have suspected that there would be a little bit more pushback on the restroom idea because of that. That situation happening there, but the community overall does not seem overly concerned about that. I think that does help too with a little bit more of education and outreach about current bathrooms and the way they're constructed and how they're much more secure than kind of just something that's an older restroom that's open all the time. I think that message has gotten out, and I think that I hope that we'll see some more support because restrooms, of course, are an ongoing project that we have in our parks. So as you can see here, and just by taking a look at it, and we'll take a look at the draft kind of schematic plan that was put together, a majority of these things actually are in that plan. The only things that really is missing from the initial list is the pickleball court. That we added because there has been such a large interest of it recently, finding places and locations for that to happen. I think we're interested in. You can see that was on the lower end of what people were looking for or would prioritize as far as in the park. As a way to facilitate more public input, we also started an online survey. It basically asked the same questions that were asked at the community meeting. From the community meeting, though, we did allow, of course, individuals to write down other facility options that they didn't see appear on the list that we had. So we did add a few to the online survey that were brought up, like horseshoes and bocce ball, other facilities that people thought would be a good addition to the park itself. We also asked a couple questions in there as well. We asked things about how the park should be constructed. I think what we see on the online survey now is that most people would like to wait a few years and construct it all at the same time if that was their choice, instead of breaking the project into multiple years and multiple phases. They are also okay with removing the aspect of Ash Street that does separate the park. So that is some feedback that we did want to get from them to understand how they felt about closing that off, because it would close that off as a connector into the neighborhood itself. And then you can start to see too the votes for the facility selection were very close to the votes that were taken at the community meeting itself. Probably most interesting, though, to talk about is when we start to talk about some type of plan. So this plan was developed, as I said, as a way to start to set up a cost estimate and understand the funding that would be needed. The city currently, right now, is underway with setting up the capital improvement budget for the next 5 years. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss that cycle, because we do understand that this is something that the community would like to see enacted sooner than later. Our goal would be to secure funding for June of, which I guess is the fiscal year 2022, but the work technically would start in June of 2021. That's basically the start of that fiscal year. So basically from that time now until that time, we're looking at using the funding that we have, the original funding that we would use for the park to work on the design basically phase and then produce the plans. And then hopefully right before that, we have our plans and our bid ready and be ready to construct in the June of 2021. So I'll just go through a little bit then of the design and some of the reasons why things are laid out in this way. The design does look at removing a Ash Street, of course, which runs basically through this area in here. So you can see that now basically the park joins itself there. Just by doing a review of the uses around the park, this side of the park over here where the park proper is currently is mostly surrounded by residential units, which tends to lead towards more programming or facilities in the park that take that into consideration, so there's not a lot of friction between the park use and what's happening in the residential use. That's why this side of the park basically was started to develop and increase its overall open green space. That space is usually, in Bulware Park, is not programmed for sports use. Definitely there is practices out there, but there's no games that are coordinated there. So it's much more felt as a more quiet, passive turf use area, giving the houses some buffering away from the more louder park activity areas. And those things would start to include the playground space, redoing the basketball court. Currently, Bulware Park has one basketball court, so maintaining that. Adding some dog park area, which again is another thing from the Parks Master Plan that we're always looking at adding space to. A picnic area, setting a restroom, and then of course, an adult fitness area there. And then you can see the development then of the cul-de-sac and then kind of how the loop pathways or the walkways then start to develop then around the pathway itself. So this will be used to review with the community and get feedback on the areas. I've actually got some feedback already because we started to post the meeting online about the playground being too small. So Bulware Park, not a very large park itself, but it does have some very large playgrounds for this park, the size that it is, and it actually has two distinct playgrounds, standard playground for kids older than 5 years old and a small tot lot playground from 2 to 5. The current design in this does not, it's very close when you start to add those two together. The tot lot does have a very large sand area or play area. That's not overly developed, it is mostly sand. So we can't quite get to that size in this design, but I think there is some desire from the community to maintain the square footage of the playgrounds themselves. And of course then, you know, in this area, the existing AT&T building would remain. The creek remains on this side, so it's definitely a lot more buffered from the residential houses than the other side of the park is, but does then combine the entire park together. It also starts to look at moving the picnic area in a much more visible location. That is definitely a concern by the residents now, is that where it is at, and especially in this corner down here, that it is very hard to observe activity going on. They have observed some activity that they would rather not see in that space. So just removing that opportunity from the overall design itself and placing that in a more open area, I think would resolve a lot of issues. I will speak about the creek for a little bit. We didn't really do any of that development in this plan. As you can see from the past presentation, that the development of the creek is an extensively costly endeavor. I think that it is well worth it in this area, especially if you can connect the other side of the bridge there and make it a full linked space. I would say that it is, I think, more difficult to select or prioritize one of those three designs that you just saw, because I think in the end that the design for that full creek will use all of the options in that design in the full design of the creek. So I think there will be some parts, probably mostly next to in the park area, where you could see 2A and 1 aspects start to work in there, and perhaps then the option of phase 3 as you get across into the Fry's area. The difficulty, of course, with the option 3 of the restoration of the creek itself in the park is that it does take up a very large portion of the usable space of the park. I should have drawn a line on here of where that is, but basically this space right here, and I'm going to show with my cursor, this space right here would be then dedicated to the laying back of the slope in the third option, which does take away a good amount of usable space. Not saying that the slope is not usable space, but very difficult to go out there and kick a soccer ball on an embankment or a slope. So, however, though, as I said, I think that there are definitely options of incorporating some of the other ideas of the design to make the creek definitely more naturalized in that area. I'd also like to point out, too, that the residents have brought up to me several times that the creek is actually used quite a bit for people that are walking from the Fry's area to El Camino. They use it as a cut-through. They also use it as a way to store things that, especially bikes that have been stolen, have been placed down in there, and that area has been used to kind of move through that space. So, channelized or not channelized, people are still going to go down there just like they are right now. So I think that that's not a thing that you should overly worry about. That's just going to be the nature of that space and moving through that space. So. For just the design itself, I think that's pretty much it. I think my goal for tonight is to get some feedback from you on if there's any other facilities you'd like to see, some feedback about the creek and the development of that. I think that the thing that does help out with the planning the green space, mostly on this side of the park and against the creek there, is that it does allow us in the future to renovate that space, just because turf area is kind of the lowest economical development that you can do of a park space. So it's much easier to tear out a large grass area than it is to tear out a large playground, of course. So I think we can have some future view of it. Of course, we would like to renovate the park, I think, a little faster than the creek channelization aspect is probably going to go, just as far as funding goes. But I think we can build into the park some buffering that in the future would allow such an expansion there. This is kind of our overall then timeline of the construction. So as I said, we're really early in the community feedback or input stage. There'll be a second community meeting that'll start to look at this design and take feedback from that. We'll then do a third community meeting where we'll take the feedback from there, show another design again, and hopefully get consensus on that. That'll then bring us back to the Parks and Recs Commission to comment on the plan, and then hopefully after that start to look at doing a park improvement ordinance. Of course, then through that time, we will be working on the construction documents, bidding it with the expectation to construct the park itself in June of 2021. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and answers.
Thank you, Peter, for your detail and passion as usual. We do have 4 members of the public to speak. I'm not going to limit you, but ask you to be concise in your speaking, particularly if you've already been spoken. But I want to invite first Ken Joy, followed by Shani Kleinhaus.
Yes, Ken Joy, I live in the Ventura neighborhood. My son is going to be 27 this year, and we had his first birthday party at Boulevard Park. So it's a place that's been important to our family for a long time. Thank you, Peter, for the work you've done to outreach to the community and to bring this preliminary layout. It looks great. I want to tell the commission that this is a regular topic at the Ventura Neighborhood Association meetings, and we're very excited that progress has gone as it has up to this point. And I'm particularly excited by the schedule here. The thought that this could begin construction in the summer of 2021 is really great. I also want to add that Jonathan Brown, who many of you I'm sure know, couldn't be here tonight, but he wanted to make sure that the members of our neighborhood came and represented for him. So that's why I'm here. So thanks also to Jonathan.
Thank you. Shani Kleinhaus, followed by Nikki Narang.
I told you I'm going to be repeating myself, but this is actually a really nice plan, and it's so nice to see an opportunity to expand the park. This was such a hot topic both at the CAC, Citizen Advisory Committee, and then following that in the Parks Master Plan stakeholder group. So it's really wonderful, and taking out a little street and putting some park in there, great. But I'm again going to ask for to really look at the creek as an opportunity. Even if the creek is concrete and you can't do a lot with it, the edges are still serving animals that move there. So plant natives and make it a little wider than you kind of think of right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shani. Nikki Narang, followed by Herb Borak.
Hi, I'm Nicky Narang. I live on Fernando Avenue. Been there 10 years now. I have a 3.5-year-old and a 5.5-year-old who've grown up in this park, so we're just thrilled, like absolutely thrilled to see this happen. I think one of the things that's interesting to ask this question during the community outreach is, why is this park not used today? You know, we are there on a daily basis. You don't see other families with young children there on a consistent basis. And you know, one of the hypotheses here is this park attracts crowds that tend to loiter throughout the day into the evenings. You know, and I think one of the questions I have here is, I was very surprised to see the restroom be the #1 amenity in the community outreach, and just questioning, are we also going to continue to encourage that behavior, and will people continue to avoid the park? Like, I guess my question is the restroom the amenity that's going to encourage park usage in the future, or will people still continue to avoid this park in the neighborhood, which is, it's a depressing thing to see more of your neighbors at Pierce Park or Ventura Park than the park on your street. Thank you.
Thank you. Herb Borak.
Chair Greenfield and Commissioners, the staff report mentions the city's purchase finalized of the Birch Street property in the fall and has a schedule for park improvement ordinance. I don't recall a park dedication ordinance for the Birch Street property. If it's already happened, I apologize for my poor memory, but if it has not, you need to have a park dedication ordinance before you can have a park improvement ordinance for that property. And in addition, you should also have a park dedication ordinance for the right-of-way on Ash Street and the part of Chestnut, right-of-way of Chestnut Avenue below the proposed cul-de-sac. Those activities need to be included in the schedule, including the Park and Recreation Commission recommendation on those park dedications, that's one of your purposes as a commission. I believe that adding the discussion of the creek restoration and placing it on the same agenda as this item and placing it before this item certainly makes it an important thing that you have to discuss. And I say, no, don't do that. As you can see, there's a schedule for the park that serves the community, and adding the possibility of treating the reach as an extension of some restoration project in the future I think is a mistake and just merely delays this project for the park. The creeks in South Palo Alto, Matadero Creek, Barron Creek, and Adobe Creek became concrete-lined drainage channels, I guess in 1988, following flooding earlier in that decade, I believe in 1983, and they serve the entire reach of that creek. And if you're doing anything that would restrict flow, that affects properties upstream. And as a priority development area, which will be adding more impervious surface and additional development in the city, the last thing I believe you want to do is any kind of modification of the creek would make it less able to handle any floodwaters, which, as we know, the amount of rainwater and flooding will probably be increasing. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. Commissioner comments. David?
One quick thing, Catherine, can we get soft copy of his presentation and their presentation from the previous one? We didn't get that in our packet. We only got the write-up. We didn't get the pictures, the diagrams.
I think we have a request to just make sure that the commissioner is forwarded all presentations from this evening, like every evening that are in the packets originally. Thank you.
As far as pickleball is concerned, I would prefer that it stay in Mitchell Park and not be spread out all over the city, because I think that that focal point is very, very, very important for their community. Second thing is parking. Do we have issues with from the neighbors regarding parking or lack of parking? How much parking is there now, and will we need more in order to encourage more people?
That is a good question. Currently, the parking is along the street. There is no street restrictions to parking in that area. It's all parallel parking. That is something that we did and have started to look at, especially in the area along this edge over here, if we wanted to start to push in there and make some head install parking. That's not something that's showed on the design now, but I think that we should discuss that a little bit with the community. Again, there is a sensitivity to the parking in that area because it has been used historically for overnight parking. Now, and this street over here in that location next to the AT&T building, surrounded mostly by commercial buildings, is that a more of an acceptable space for that to happen? That's really not for me to say, but it's maybe something that we should look at, because definitely with the expansion of the playground, bigger picnic area, dog park, those things are going to draw, of course, more people to the park to use it. I think some expansion of the parking wouldn't be a bad thing to explore.
Okay. And as far as the overnight parking, we have issues with that all over the city, and enforcement will need to be beefed up, at least initially. The last question was to do with the speaker talking about naming basketball courts. I don't know if you want to make this a test case. I'm all for it.
I think that it doesn't hurt anything. It can only use to promote the facility, which I don't see as a bad opportunity. So I think that is something that could be definitely considered.
Vice Chair Cribbs.
Thank you. So first of all, I was really happy to see that the restrooms are at the top of the list, so that's a great thing. Secondly, was there ever a thought of doing a small building that could be used for a community gathering space, kind of like we have at Mitchell next to the bathrooms? And
That wasn't something that was brought.
It never came up?
Staff, no, and not from the community either. I would say that the park is not overly, large in itself, so having a structure out there using.
Not a good idea.
I don't know if it's not a good idea, but it's definitely something that wasn't expressed by the community as something needed. Now, it wasn't brought up as a choice out there, so I don't know if that was something that determined that, but, it is something that could be considered.
About the choices, it was really good to see the list of all the choices and the neighborhood input. But I'm concerned, since this is such a great opportunity, and that's a dense neighborhood in Palo Alto, is there an opportunity to get more input from the community? Or are you happy with 30?
We had a fairly good showing at the community meeting. As far as community meetings go, we had about 26 people there. Of course, they come and go during the meeting. As of today, the online survey has accumulated 68 responses, I believe.
Good.
So I think that it's doing a fairly good job. I did extend it to this week. It was supposed to actually close last Friday, but I'm closing it this Friday. That doesn't mean that we couldn't extend it another week. It does seem to help that the last few times that I've pushed it out over the email to the community group that there has been spikes that go up. So we may try that again one more time to see if we can get a few more folks. But for the community in that area, and the size, having somewhere between 60 and 80 responses is pretty solid for
Good.
that information.
Thank you.
Keith?
Sorry, I wasn't right there. For the playground, that's right against the creek there, and if we do expand the creek, that would be problematic. Was there any thought about rotating that playground counterclockwise around the cul-de-sac and to be over and exchange that with some of the turf area?
That can definitely be, yes, something that we can definitely explore.
Okay. And I assume that this turf area is big enough to have like AYSO soccer on it?
For little tiny kids playing, yes.
Yeah, for the youngest,
Not for adults, but definitely
I'm talking about the tots.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Another thing that would be useful is both Seal and Robles have small little backstops for the smallest baseball teams. So it wouldn't be a baseball field, it would just be on the grass. And that's pretty unobtrusive, and you get some functionality out of that. My kids spend plenty of time playing on those grass fields, and it really doesn't prevent anything as long as you can get that backstop in the corner somewhere. Otherwise, yeah, it looks beautiful. Thank you.
Jeff?
Yeah, I echo Keith's comments about the use of the turf area. I see that there's a space for community garden plots. Is that existing already, or would that be something new, or?
That space is what happens there is there's a city pump station that sits right here, and then there's just a non-used or unused small turf area that we
I think it's great to look for spaces like that and to be able to have that community have access to something like that. What, as far as the turf area goes, what is the size, or what's the distance maybe on the top? I don't know if you know.
I know
roughly.
it's about 25% larger or more turf area than what is out there right now.
Okay.
I can't give you the exact dimensions of it, but I'm going to say that it is about 35 by 85.
Okay. Great.
As far as feet go, yards go. So it's not a full-scale field, but it is much more expansive now to use it. Right now, it's fairly broken up because the basketball court actually takes up this whole area and the picnic, and it's really, this is the turf area. You can see underneath the green right there, the existing playground. So much smaller turf area. It's open out there, but it's not conducive to playing anything on it. So this would allow that to happen a little bit more.
Okay. And I also really like tying the two parks together as far as, getting rid of the street, if that's doable and favored by the community. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you.
Jackie?
All right, you really jammed a lot of things in here. This is great. I had questions about parking as well, but it sounds like you have that in mind. Is there lighting in the basketball courts in particular, or is there any lighting in the park at night?
There are a few lights there now, mostly older street lights there for just security, not for really illuminating play activity. It's mostly just to illuminate it for security purposes. At the minimum, we would continue to do that. I think, though, that in the basketball court area, it would be probably nicer to have some brighter lights there to allow the use at night, especially for the dog park, because, and again, why to concentrate those things all together away from the houses, much easier to start putting light in. That's always a sensitive discussion when we want to light a field next to residential areas. So, but I think that we would definitely pursue adding light there that could use the park, especially in winter, of course. Technically, I think our policy is that the parks close at 10 p.m. Is when they're supposed to close. So no one goes out there to kick people out, of course, but it would be controlled to that time, so the intensity of the light would probably go back down to security level at that time.
Okay. I thought on the community list that the creek overlook was pretty highly ranked there. Is that appearing on here somewhere? Were we able to fit that in?
No, actually, this plan was made before the community meeting. I think we're going to add something for a creek outlook there. I'm not quite sure what that means yet, and the form that it takes. That's something I think we were going to work on developing and seeing what we can do there. There was some talk before about the cantilevered walkway at Wilkie Way. So it could be something similar to that, but in a smaller segment that just allows you to have a better look at the creek itself. I think that it would be used more for educational purposes about the creek and trying to promote, I think, the idea of perhaps naturalizing it one day. Because it is not very pretty to look at the channelized creek itself, but it is definitely a natural resource that's there that could be enhanced, of course, more. So.
Yeah, okay, great. And I like that you fit the loop walk in all the way around as well. The only thing I was thinking is maybe it could use some shade for those hot days, but I think it's fantastic to be able to do that loop.
On the plan itself, it's showing mostly the existing trees there. I think we start to show some trees around this center walkway, but I think we definitely would plant a lot more. That is kind of a good actually segue. I would state that as far as planting of parks go, and especially over the last few years, that we definitely try to use mostly native plant material itself. We would start to use that here as well. It works in great locations, especially up here along the houses where there is a large area of ivy that could definitely be removed and replaced as a pollinator native habitat area. I think that's a perfect place for it. I do want to promote that in every park that we do. I think we're going to do a lot more of that in Rinconada Park pretty soon when we start renovating it. And then just to speak to the Ross Road planting was a little bit more difficult as there is no irrigation there. It all has to survive basically on its own, which is a tough thing to do. Most of the time, at least you have some type of irrigation to establish the plant material. So the plant material that was chosen for that was done because no one was going to give it any love and give it any water. But we do actually incorporate a few California natives in that the buckwheat, 2 types of them are used along that route, which should do fairly well there. I do, though, agree that where we can, that we should be using as many native plant material. And not, I think the early idea of native was native to California. I think we've now progressed to ourselves that it's native to here. So, which is a much more tighter plant palette. I think that presentation, though, at the beginning, which gives me more hope about using more native plant material, is the amount of plant material that's now available. So this is now only a thing really over the past 15 years, and over the past 5 years was where you can start to find like really native local plant material that you could never find before unless you had someone growing it specially for you. So that is a much more exciting aspect of it as far as planting goes, and getting those native habitat areas into parkland.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I have a few specific and more general comments. Regarding the community gardens, I've been the community garden liaison for the past 3 years, and I'm all in favor of them. I am potentially questioning this garden spot. It looks small. I'm wondering how it compares in size to, for example, Johnson Park. It's a half mile from the Ventura Community Garden. I'm concerned about management overhead. So I think it's something we should consider.
That space is very small. I would say it's probably double the size of this open space that we're looking at in front of us. So it would not be a very large community garden. It would just provide the opportunity to do that. Of course, if the commission and the community felt that it needed to have more, I think that down there in that area, closer to the end, the turf becomes kind of tight there, and that's another space too. Use it for a community garden or for bocce ball or things like that would be considered for kind of this space down.
Thanks. I guess I'd be interested in some guidance potentially from Darren and Catherine down the road on that one. And I appreciate the questions on the soccer field size, and I was concerned when you were talking about the potential noise of the residents' houses there, which would abut the potential soccer field, although there is a basketball court there now, so maybe that's not such a significant concern. It's not as bad as a bouncing ball, perhaps. Parking questions, I think, get exacerbated if we start talking about potential restoration projects, and something that becomes a draw, so those are discussions we'll need to have down the road. We definitely want to make our parks safe and welcoming to families and everyone, so I think we need to look into issues that we have at the park there now as we plan for the future infrastructure of the park. Regarding native plants and all, native here is good, but I think we need to be focusing on climate adaptive species, and so native here and native what's coming here or migrating here or what we're becoming. I think and I'm sure, I trust we'll add a lot more trees, so thank you.
Definitely.
It seems like the big picture, though, is, as we talk about this creek restoration project, it doesn't really seem to flow with the beautiful design that you put together here. So I'm wondering if we need to reconsider this design, not assuming that something's definitely going to happen, but something that would lend itself well to adapt and fit in if we did add some creek restoration here. And with the kind of the segmented design, the way it is right now, maybe you would do something different. You talked about moving the playground already, but I certainly don't want to put this project on hold, waiting for something to happen. We need to move forward with something, but we have this information. I'm not sure to what extent the creek restoration idea was floated with the community in the community meeting, but that should definitely be a front center topic in the next presentation. Get their feedback and see what comes out of this. We don't have many opportunities to restructure a park in the way that we're doing it right now, so we want to make sure we do it the right way.
Well, I would point out in the design that we did the easement from the back of the channel wall out that the Water District likes to maintain is 10 feet. In this, we did maintain a 20-foot setback for future development of the creek there to try to limit the amount of impact on the usable space of the park. I don't know if you've ever been to San Luis Obispo and walked around the Mission area. They did a very fantastic job of restoring their creekside there. They use the channel walls, though, a lot within the design, and they keep it into mostly the area that the channel was, but they do a very good job of doing that. And I can see, and that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, I think that there is a lot of opportunity to start mixing all those options together that we looked at earlier and come up with actually what the design is going to be. I think it's very difficult for the commission, when asked to, like, which one would we rather do? It's hard to say. Of course, we'd rather do the most thing that has the most impact, which is probably the third one, but economics and usability of land and all those things kind of start to then focus that development of the creek. And I think that within the envelope that we're showing on the plan here, that we could restore that side of the creek that's on the park side and making it accessible without actually encroaching in there too much and laying it back that far. So I think there's a best of both worlds in there myself.
Thank you. One final comment is, asking what specific assistance the commission can give you on this, and I know we have a park and amenity ad hoc, and I don't know if this would be within their purview to potentially become more involved with the park design, so that's something, discussion we can have. Any further very quick comments? David?
As far as getting down to the creek, that area of the open turf down in the lower left-hand corner, if you had just one path, you don't have to have the entire length go down to the creek. You could have just a little path down from there. That would be great, rather than trying to put the whole thing sloping down to the creek.
Right. No, and I totally agree with you. That's where I start to say that there's like a mix of those things that can happen here. I think that definitely down there that can be developed and be a lot more naturalized. When we start to talk about things too, like the flow of the water or the building up of sediment, because it's going to go from a channelized environment to now a more naturalized environment, that interface is going to be the most fragile, of course. So, and that's going to happen basically right in that area. So leaving that area then open for future development and laying it back more, or developing some type of larger pool that's basically down there, I think definitely behooves us to have built into the design. Now, as it gets up the creek and closer to the road, I think you can start to use the walls and terrace it down, but still get down to the bottom, of course, and then naturalize the bottom as well. So you can definitely get down there. Again, I would behoove you to just Google the San Luis mission, and you'll start to see the pictures of it. I mean, they've naturally even put rocks at the bottom so you can walk down there, and it looks natural, but it is a man-made environment, but it's definitely accessible. Of course, I really can't put a value on that play activity. I grew up in an environment like that and played in it every day, and it was amazing. I think that helped me be what I am now as a landscape architect, and it would be nice to recreate that riparian situation in the park itself. I think that goes actually for every creek in a park that we have, and making that a goal over the next 100 years to do. So.
Yes, Councilmember Koo, please.
Thank you. So Peter, the park will have electrical outlets, right?
It will, in the park itself, we do try to control the amount of electrical plug access, just because we found that a lot of people use it to just start charging their phones and doing things of that nature. This park in particular doesn't really have like a group gathering area. Definitely the picnic areas will have some power opportunity for them. The bathroom, of course, will have power opportunity, but we do try to control those as much as possible and leave them wide open. I think that the best example of open plugs is right out in front of City Hall. It happens here. So you can see the furniture is moved to be close to the plugs.
I see.
Because that's basically what they're mostly being used for. So.
Thank you. The only reason I ask is because at Barron Park we have movie nights, and we have one plug. So in order to make popcorn, we have to take out the plug for the movie to make popcorn. So that was just a question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That is a good point, that this turf area would be a great spot for movies. So.
No, and I would say that the standards for electrical are a lot higher than they were when most of the parks in Palo Alto were built. So most of the older parks, the infrastructure for that has either gone by the wayside long ago or is barely hanging on. But today we would build it much tougher of an infrastructure. So like things like Magical Bridge has power at the Playhouse that's used all the time. Which is still, of course, problematic every once in a while, but I think the way that it's constructed is durable enough to survive. So I think that's always one of the key components, of course, of having stuff in the park.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is the ad hoc committee liaison and liaison updates. It's well after 10 o'clock now, and I know we want to be moving out of here. The one item that I would suggest that we want to spend a little time about is tentative agenda planning, not necessarily for our next meeting, but for our retreat, which I'd like to, so if it's okay with everyone else, we'll move past the ad hoc updates and people can read what we've submitted already. So then as we move on to the tentative agenda, I think we can table, if we do end up having a retreat between now and the next meeting, then we don't need to worry about the agenda. But real quickly, I can read what Darren has already suggested tentatively for next month, and you can email me your comments. One is 7.7 acres plan. This could be an action depending on what happens between now and then. Then non-action updates on the horizontal levee project, garden guidelines, community garden guidelines that we've been working on finalizing, and the first tee proposal, which Ann is helping out with and familiar with. So moving on, typically we have a retreat, which is really a 4-hour meeting that we'll have on a weekday. Typically, in the past, we've done it between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. on a Friday morning. Looking at our calendar, last year we had our retreat 2.5 weeks after the January meeting. That would put us on February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, and it's the Friday of President's Weekend, which might not be the best date. Backing up, I'm going to suggest a request that staff send out a doodle poll with some dates for commissioners to provide input on what days work. But I'm going to suggest that we look at days other than Fridays. If we move to the next Friday, then that's the Friday before our February meeting, which puts an extra burden on staff and commissioners by concentrating time. So I'm guessing that neither of these days is ideal. The previous Friday is probably too soon to pull this off. So I'm looking for feedback on what other days of the week would potentially work. And I've spoken with Darren already, and he said other days should be open to staff.
For me, Monday through Thursday would be pretty hard. So I prefer Friday. Friday is something I have a little more flexibility. Saturday and Sunday, I'm not sure if we want to go there or not.
It would be good to have a doodle. Are you familiar with that, where you put 10 different dates on and we see who's got the best?
Yes, that's what I'm suggesting already. I'm trying to see if we can whittle it down a little bit rather than have 20 dates on there, Monday through Friday.
I'm pretty flexible, so
Yeah, I'm fairly flexible, but I mean, again, just would need to see the dates, especially for the morning times. But, you know, I guess that doesn't narrow it down very much, but I have flexibility.
So since I just said I was pretty flexible, what about if we did something in the afternoon and went to early evening instead of doing it in the morning on another day during the week, since Fridays are bad now? The Fridays left in February are not so good. Just a thought.
Yep. I was going to say Fridays are generally easier for me to be flexible as well, but afternoons tend to be easier too, particularly the further out they are. I can block it off early and manage my calendar.
Do afternoons help you at all, Keith?
Doodle poll.
Yeah, doodle poll.
Yeah.
I have the rail is clogging up every Wednesday afternoon, so.
Okay. That gives me something to work on with staff, and we'll work on getting a doodle poll out soon. Does anyone have any further comments or announcements?
I do, and they're both good. One is that the Palo Alto Masters is doing great. They've signed up about 30 people for this month, and they're feeling really good about where they are, and I'm excited about that. This is our new Masters team. And in addition, swimming, and in addition, Tim is going to start a bridge program between swimming lessons and Palo Alto Swim Club to make some non-competitive kind of thing there. So he's excited about that. And then I went to the youth council meeting today, and it was great. We should be very proud of our youth council. They are busy doing a panel discussion and community meeting about vaping, complete with a survey, and they picked a date. I think it's the 3rd of April. And so they were very pleased that we were interested, and I think it would be great, Darren, if we could invite them to come to the commission like we did a couple of years ago, and have them give a report specifically on this vaping. So.
David?
Two announcements. The initial speaker that we had talking about music at Mitchell Park, I went to 2 of his events, and they were fantastic as far as building community. And he's got 10 more scheduled over this year at the Mitch. So I encourage people to notice his ad in the Palo Alto Weekly and get people to use our parks more in that way. And then the last thing is that you got this, I'm the GSI liaison, and you got this stormwater plan, but we're going to cover this in a March or April agenda. So if you just look at the executive summary ahead of time, I've been going to see how the parks could fit into this, because this covers not only the parks, but also all city land and all development on all private property. So we want to focus our efforts on how the parks can help. And that's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Koo?
Commissioner Olson had spoken about the eminent domain, and if I remember correctly, the Great Separation Extended Citizen Advisory Panel, when they came to council, they mentioned that there was going to be they've invited an eminent domain lawyer to speak at one of their meetings. I just don't remember the date.
Yeah, it's scheduled right now for the 5th, February 5th.
February the 5th.
When we confirm that, I'll mail that out
Okay.
to the commission.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Can I make a comment?
Yes, you may.
So you're asking about the presentations, David? There are links, and I'm just not sure that everybody's seeing that in the packet. Are you not seeing that? Yeah, so if you just hover over the attachments in your document.
What I saw was just written description, no images. When you look at the attachment.
When you hovered it and clicked on it, it didn't open up for you?
It did, and I saw just description.
Oh.
Like this.
But within the staff reports, down at the bottom of the attachments, if you hover over them, the links are there.
Okay.
And then the
All right.
presentations would open up.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that just in case the public's having the same problem.
To a link.
So sometimes the presentations change between when they're posted in the packet and what's delivered here, so it'd be good to get updates there. Also, I think in the packets, maybe if you underlined anything that's a link, that might make it easier to recognize, or even change the font or come up with something.
Yeah, I'll look at it and see what I can do about that.
Yep, thank you. And one last comment, everybody has a roster, a contact list. If any information is on your contact is not correct, please be sure to let staff know. With that, do I have a motion?
I so move.
To adjourn, please? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much, everyone.